The air in Winterfell's crypt was heavy, laden with the weight of centuries. Each stone in the walls and floor seemed to hold whispers of the past, secrets borne by the dead. Jon Snow's footsteps echoed softly as he descended the spiral staircase, the torch in his hand casting flickering light against the cold, grey stone. The shadows of the carved faces on the tombs danced in the wavering glow, their stoic expressions seeming almost alive. It was a place meant to inspire reverence, but tonight it felt different to Jon, more than just a final farewell. This crypt, with its rows of silent watchers, always reminded him of his place in the world. The Stark blood flowed through his veins, but not his name. That, above all, was why he walked these halls tonight, searching for clarity and comfort before leaving Winterfell forever. Tomorrow, Jon would ride to Castle Black. He would take the Black Cloak and swear his oaths to the Night's Watch. He would trade his uncertain life in Winterfell for the harsh, unyielding certainty of duty. No wives, no children, no claim to lands or titles. It was the only future he could imagine for himself, the only one offered to a bastard. And yet, as he moved deeper into the crypt, his heart felt heavy with unspoken words and unfulfilled dreams. He would miss Robb's laughter, Arya's fierce independence, and Bran's endless curiosity. Even Sansa, with her quiet disdain, and Rickon, too young to understand the world, would leave holes in his life. Only Ghost, his loyal direwolf, would accompany him to the wall. Jon stopped before a particular tomb, his breath misting the frigid air. It was Lyanna Stark's, the sister of his father Eddard Stark. Her statue was youthful and beautiful, her face carved with a delicate sadness. In her stone hands, she held a bundle of carved flowers, and the words engraved at the base spoke of her untimely death, a death that had set the Seven Kingdoms aflame. Jon knelt before the statue, resting his torch on the ground to free his hands. He ran a gloved finger over the stone flowers, his expression thoughtful. "Goodbye, Aunt Lyanna," he murmured. His voice was soft, almost swallowed by the crypt's silence. "I wish I could have known you. They say you were kind and brave. I hope I have some of that in me." He bowed his head, his thoughts lingering on her legacy. Lyanna, the wild flower of Winterfell, whose kidnapping had sparked Robert's rebellion. How different might the world be if she had lived? As Jon rose, his eyes caught something unusual, a faint glimmer near the base of the statue. He frowned, leaning closer. A thin crack had formed along the stone where the base met the floor. It wasn't just a wear of time, it looked almost unnatural, as though the stone had been forced apart from within. The glint came again, faint but undeniable. Jon crouched, his curiosity piqued. He hesitated, unwilling to disturb the resting place of his father's beloved sister, but his hand moved almost on its own. He touched the edge of the crack lightly. The stone shifted. Jon froze, his breath catching in his throat. He withdrew his hand, half expecting the statue to collapse, but nothing happened. Instead, the fragment of stone crumbled away easily, revealing a small hollow beneath the base. From the hollow, something rolled forward and landed with a soft thud at his feet. Jon stared, his torchlight glinting off the object. It was smooth and pale, its surface marked with fine swirling lines that seemed to shimmer like veins of frost. He reached out, his hand trembling, lifted it carefully. It was a dragon egg. Bone white and warm to the touch, it felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of history itself. Jon turned it over in his hands, marvelling at the intricate patterns etched into the shell. The torchlight flickered, casting long shadows across the crypt. The egg seemed to absorb the light, its surface gleaming faintly. Jon's thoughts raced. He had heard tales of dragon eggs, relics of a bygone age when Targaryens ruled the skies. But what was one doing here, hidden in the crypt of a Stark? Before he could make sense of it, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Jon." Jon turned sharply, clutching the egg to his chest. His father, Eddard Stark, stood at the base of the stairs, his face half hidden in shadow. Ned's eyes went to the egg immediately, his expression unreadable. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Put the egg down, Jon." Jon blinked, his grip tightening instinctively. "You know what this is?" "Aye," Ned said, his voice calm but edged with something deeper. "And so must you, but not here." Jon hesitated, his mind awhirl with questions, but the look in his father's eyes left no room for argument. Slowly he nodded. Moments later, they sat by the fire in the great hall. The dragon egg lay between them on the table, its surface glimmering faintly in the firelight. Jon stared at it, his heart pounding. Ned sat across from him, his face grave. "This egg is a relic of a past long buried," he said, "and a truth that must remain hidden." "What truth?" Jon asked, his voice trembling. Ned hesitated, his gaze dropping to the egg. "The truth about you, Jon. About who you are." Jon's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Ned took a deep breath, his hands tightening into fists on the table. "You've always been told you're my son, born of a dishonourable union during Robert's rebellion. But that's far from the whole truth." Jon's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, his eyes searching his father's face. "What are you saying?" "You are not my son," Ned said quietly. "You are my sister's son, Lyanna's." Jon's breath caught. He shook his head, trying to make sense of the words. "That can't be. She died giving birth to me." Ned nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, she died protecting you. Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen." The words hit Jon like a blow. He stared at the egg, its bone-white surface suddenly taking on a new significance. "A Targaryen," Jon whispered. The name felt foreign on his tongue, yet it stirred something deep within him. Ned reached across the table, gripping Jon's hand. "You were hidden to protect you. If Robert had known, he would have had you killed. The egg, it must have been hidden with Lyanna, a reminder of your heritage. But Jon, listen to me. You are my son in every way that matters. I raised you, I protected you, I loved you. That will never change." Jon looked up, his eyes filling with questions, but there was no time for answers. The egg, as if responding to the firelight, began to glow faintly. A warmth spread across the room, subtle but unmistakable. "What's happening?" Jon asked, his voice tinged with awe. Ned rose, his hand on his sword hilt. "I don't know. We must be careful. The world is not ready for dragons to return, Jon, and neither are we." Jon nodded, his gaze never leaving the egg. For the first time in his life, he felt the stirrings of something greater, a destiny that reached beyond the wall, beyond Winterfell, beyond the life he had always known. And in that moment, he understood one thing with certainty. His story was only beginning. The fire in the great hall crackled softly as Jon Snow sat across from his father, staring at the dragon egg that had upended everything he thought he knew. Bone white and etched with veins of frost-like patterns, it pulsed faintly in the firelight, as if alive. Jon's mind reeled with the weight of the revelation he had just heard. He wasn't Eddard Stark's son. He was a Targaryen, the son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. "What do I do now?" Jon finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ned's gaze was steady but clouded with worry. "No one must know, Jon. Not about you, not about the egg." He leaned closer, his tone firm. "Take it to your room tonight, but do not show it to anyone. We'll speak more in the morning." Jon nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down upon him. "What about the night's watch? You were going to send me to the wall." Ned hesitated and sighed heavily. "I'll speak to Benjen. I'll tell him you're not ready yet, but you cannot stay in Winterfell for long. If anyone finds out about the egg or your true heritage, Robert will come for you, for both of you." Jon's chest tightened at the thought. The idea of leaving Winterfell forever, felt like a blade twisting in his heart, but he could see the unyielding determination in his father's eyes. "Go, Jon. Get some rest," Ned said finally. "We'll decide what must be done tomorrow." Jon carried the egg carefully to his room, its strange coldness biting through his gloves. The journey through the darkened halls of Winterfell felt surreal. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow on the walls seemed to conspire against him, making his heart race. When he reached his chambers, Ghost stirred from his place by the hearth, lifting his head and sniffing the air. The direwolf's crimson eyes locked on the egg, and he let out a low, curious whine. "It's all right, boy," Jon murmured, setting the egg gently on his bed. He sat beside it, running his fingers over the intricate lines etched into its shell. Sleep didn't come easily. Jon lay on his side, the egg beside him, its cold presence a constant reminder of how drastically his life had changed. He drifted off eventually, though his dreams were restless. Visions of fire and snow, of shadowy wings soaring over a vast battlefield. A faint, crackling sound pulled Jon from his uneasy sleep. His eyes snapped open, and he bolted upright, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. The sound came again, a sharp crack, and Jon's gaze flew to the egg. He froze. A thin fracture ran along the surface, glowing faintly like molten steel. As he watched, another crack split the shell, then another, spidering outward in a dazzling web of light. The air seemed to hum with energy, and Ghost let out a low growl, his hackles rising. Jon's breath caught as the shell began to crumble. Pieces of the egg flew away, revealing something moving inside. A tiny, clawed foot broke through first, followed by the rest of the creature. Out of the egg emerged a dragon. Its scales were a shimmering white, almost iridescent, catching the faint light of the room and reflecting it in a cascade of colours. Its wings were translucent, edged with veins of silver, and its eyes burned with a piercing blue intensity. Jon was too stunned to move. The creature let out a soft, high-pitched chirp, shaking off the last fragments of its shell. It looked up at Jon and tilted its head, curious and unafraid. Jon's fear melted into awe as the dragon moved closer, nudging his hand with its snout. Its skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold shell it had emerged from. A strange sensation coursed through Jon, an inexplicable bond, as if this creature had always been a part of him. The first rays of dawn were breaking when Jon rushed to find his father. He carried the dragon, now curled up in a bundle of fur he had hastily wrapped around it, close to his chest. Ghost trotted silently at his side, his eyes darting nervously. When he reached the Lord's chambers, Jon knocked urgently. Ned opened the door moments later, still pulling on his tunic. His expression shifted from irritation to shock as he saw what Jon held. "It hatched," Jon said breathlessly. "It's alive." Ned stared at the tiny dragon, his face a mixture of awe and dread. He stepped aside to let Jon in, closing the door behind him. "This changes everything," Ned muttered, pacing the room. "If Robert finds out," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. Jon looked down at the dragon, which was now nestled comfortably in the fur, its eyes half closed. "What do we do?" Ned turned to face him, his expression resolute. "I'm sorry, Jon, but you can't stay here. Not with this." Jon's stomach dropped. "But it's not safe," Ned interrupted, his voice firm. "For you or the dragon. If Robert hears even a whisper, he'll send men to kill you both, and I can't protect you here." Jon felt a lump rise in his throat. "Where will I go?" Ned's gaze softened, though his tone remained steady. "To the Neck. To Howland Reed. He's a loyal friend and knows the truth about you. No word of this will leave Greywater Watch." The words hit Jon like a blow. He had always known his place in Winterfell was tenuous, but this felt like exile. Still, he could see the pain in his father's eyes, and knew Ned wasn't doing this lightly. "I'll send 10 of my most trusted men to escort you," Ned continued. You'll leave under cover of darkness. Jon nodded, though his heart ached. Will I ever come back? Ned hesitated. I don't know, Jon, but I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. As the first hints of dawn touched the sky, Jon stood at the gates of Winterfell. His dragon was hidden in a sturdy wooden crate, lined with blankets to keep it warm. The 10 men chosen to accompany him waited silently, their expressions grim. Ned stood before him, his face etched with sorrow. I've told the others that you left early with Benjen to join the Night's Watch. No one will question it. Jon swallowed hard, his throat tight. Thank you. For everything. Ned pulled him into a rare embrace, holding him tightly. Stay safe, Jon. And remember, you are a Stark, no matter what name you bear. Jon nodded, unable to speak. He mounted his horse, his heart heavy as he looked back at Winterfell one last time. When the rest of the family awoke, Ned stood in the courtyard, his hands clasped behind his back. He told them all that Jon had left at dawn with Benjen, his voice steady despite the weight of the lie. Arya looked disappointed, Sansa indifferent, and Bran curious. Robb alone seemed troubled, but he said nothing. As the family dispersed, Ned lingered, staring out at the horizon. The sun rose slowly, casting its golden light over Winterfell. Inside, his heart was heavy with worry. The world was changing, and the arrival of the dragon was a sign of things to come. He prayed that Jon would find safety in the Neck, far from the reach of kings and their swords. But in his heart, he knew that peace would not last forever. Jon's journey, and his destiny, had only just begun. The swampy terrain of the Neck sprawled out before Jon Snow and the 10 Stark bannermen sent to escort him. The land was treacherous, marked by shifting marshes, dense fog, and waterways that twisted endlessly. It was a world far removed from the snow-covered hills of Winterfell. Ghost padded silently alongside Jon's horse, his white fur stark against the drab greens and browns of the bog. The dragon, Jon had yet to name it, remained hidden in its crate, carried carefully by one of the bannermen. Occasionally, Jon thought he heard faint chirps from within, muffled by the wooden confines. The journey had been arduous, their progress slowed by the unpredictable landscape. Though the men were seasoned warriors, none of them knew how to navigate the swamp's maze-like channels. Greywater Watch, the elusive stronghold of the Crannogmen, was said to move, making it nearly impossible to find without a guide. Do you think this castle of theirs even exists? Asked Sir Alaric, a grizzled soldier who had fought alongside Ned Stark during Robert's rebellion. He squinted into the thick fog, muttering a curse under his breath. It exists, Jon said with more confidence than he felt. Lord Reed is my father's oldest friend. He'll find us. But doubt gnawed at Jon's thoughts. What if Greywater Watch didn't appear? What if they were lost in the swamp for days, exposed to the elements and unseen dangers? It happened without warning. One moment they were winding through a narrow path, flanked by moss-draped trees, the swamp eerily silent. The next, arrows thudded into the ground around them. Startled horses whinnied and reared as Crannogmen emerged from the undergrowth, their spears and bows aimed directly at the Stark bannermen. Ghost snarled, positioning himself protectively in front of Jon. "Hold!" Jon shouted, raising a hand to his men. He turned to the Crannogmen, whose faces were painted with mud and whose movements were so quiet they seemed like shadows come to life. One of them, a short man with sharp, piercing eyes, stepped forward. His spear was levelled at Jon, but his voice was calm. "You trespass in the lands of the Crannogmen. State your purpose." Jon straightened in his saddle, forcing himself to appear calm, despite the tension crackling in the air. "I am Jon Snow, sent by my father, Eddard Stark, to seek the protection of Howland Reed." The mention of Eddard Stark seemed to give the men pause. He glanced at his companions, then back at Jon. If you speak the truth, then Lord Reed will decide your fate. Come with us." The Crannog men melted back into the swamp, signalling for the group to follow. They led Jon and his escort through a labyrinth of waterways and mist-shrouded paths, the air thick with the sounds of chirping frogs and the distant calls of unseen creatures. When Greywater Watch finally came into view, Jon understood why it was said to move. The castle seemed to rise out of the swamp itself, its wooden towers blending seamlessly with the trees. Platforms connected by rope bridges swayed gently in the breeze, and the entire structure seemed alive, as though it had grown from the land rather than having been built. Jon was led into the largest of the wooden halls, where Howland Reed waited. The Lord of the Crannog men was smaller than Jon expected, but his presence filled the room. His eyes were sharp, and his expression betrayed nothing as Jon and the bannermen were brought before him. "Jon Snow," Howland said, his voice quiet but commanding. "What brings the son of Eddard Stark to my halls?" Jon stepped forward, his heart pounding. He felt the weight of the dragon's crate in his hands as he set it down. "My father sent me here because it is no longer safe for me in Winterfell. He told me the truth about who I am, about my mother, Lyanna Stark, and my father, Rhaegar Targaryen." A flicker of recognition crossed Howland's face, but he remained silent as Jon continued. "That's not all," Jon said, his voice steady despite the enormity of his words. He knelt and opened the crate, revealing the tiny dragon curled up inside. Its scales shimmered in the dim light, and it let out a soft chirp, blinking up at the gathered men. A collective gasp filled the room. Howland Reed stepped closer, his eyes wide with astonishment. "A dragon," he murmured. "By the old gods, it lives." Jon nodded. "My father said Robert Baratheon would kill us both if he found out. That's why he sent me to you." Howland knelt beside Jon, his expression softening. "Your father was right to send you here. Greywater Watch will protect you. And your dragon. No word of this will leave the neck." The Crannog men murmured their assent, their loyalty to their lord clear. Howland turned back to Jon. "You are safe here, Jon Snow, and while you are under my protection, I will teach you what I can. The ways of the Crannog men may serve you well in the years to come." Life in Greywater Watch was unlike anything Jon had known. The Crannog men were skilled in stealth and survival, their techniques honed by generations of living in the swamp. Howland taught Jon to move silently through the bog, to read the signs of the land, and to hunt with precision. Ghost took to the swamp as naturally as Jon did, the direwolf's white fur often smeared with mud to blend in with his surroundings. The dragon grew rapidly, its appetite voracious. It was a challenge to keep the creature hidden, but the Crannog men were adept at keeping secrets. The dragon seemed to understand Jon in ways that were almost human, their bond deepening with each passing day. For the first time in his life, Jon had felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a bastard. He was something more, though he wasn't sure exactly what. Far to the south, Eddard Stark rode towards King's Landing, the weight of his new role as Hand of the King heavy on his shoulders. The road was long, and the company of Robert Baratheon did little to ease his mind. The king was jovial and loud, reminiscing about their shared past, but Ned's thoughts were elsewhere, on Jon, on the dragon, and on the danger that loomed over them all. Each night as the campfire crackled, Ned stared into the flames and wondered if he had made the right choice. He had always believed in honor and duty, but the birth of the dragon had shaken those beliefs to their core. The return of dragons could change everything. Worse, it could bring war to the realm. Ned resolved to keep Jon's secret at all costs, even from Robert. But in his heart he knew the peace of the Seven Kingdoms was as fragile as a candle in the wind, and with each mile that brought him closer to King's Landing, the storm on the horizon grew darker. As Jon stood on the watchtower of Greywater Watch one evening, his dragon perched on his shoulder, the swamp bathed in the golden light of sunset, He felt the stirrings of a new sense of destiny. He didn't know what the future held, whether he would remain hidden, or if he would one day take his place in the world as a Targaryen. But for now, he was safe, and he was not alone. In the distance, the croaking of frogs and the rustle of leaves blended into the symphony of the swamp, a reminder that even in the most desolate places, life endured, and so would Jon Snow. Weeks had passed since Jon Snow had first arrived at Greywater Watch. In that time, the swamp had transformed from a hostile maze of mist and marsh to a place that felt, inexplicably, like home. The Crannogmen treated him with a respect and camaraderie he had never known in Winterfell. They shared their secrets freely, how to blend into the shadows, how to move silently across waterlogged terrain, and how to fight with speed and precision. Jon had taken to their teachings with surprising ease, his natural agility and keen mind serving him well. His dragon, however, remained the greatest source of both wonder and challenge. No longer the fragile hatchling he had carried from Winterfell, the creature had grown rapidly, now nearly as large as Ghost. Its once delicate scales had hardened into a gleaming white armour, streaked with faint veins of silver that shimmered in the swamp's filtered light. Though Jon had yet to name it, the bond between them was undeniable. The dragon, curious, intelligent, and fiercely protective, followed him everywhere, its piercing blue eyes often fixed on him as if it could read his thoughts. The Crannogmen, wary at first, had grown accustomed to its presence, though they gave it a wide berth out of reverence and fear. Ghost, too, seemed to have formed an understanding with the dragon, the two creatures often seen lying side by side near the hearth. For the first time in his life, Jon felt like he had belonged. The constant weight of being a bastard, the shame that had followed him like a shadow in Winterfell, seemed to melt away in the swamps. The Crannogmen saw him not as an outsider, but as one of their own. He was no longer just Jon Snow. He was someone more. The morning mist clung heavily to the air as Jon stood in the training circle, sparring with Mira Reed. Her movements were quick and fluid, her spear striking with precision. Jon parried with his sword, sweat dripping from his brow as he tried to anticipate her next move. Too slow, Mira taunted, dancing around him and landing a light tap on his shoulder with the butt of her spear. Jon grinned, shifting his stance. "Let's see you dodge this." He lunged forward with a feint, then swept his blade low. Mira jumped back, but her foot slipped on the wet ground and Jon seized the moment to press his advantage. Before he could land a decisive blow, however, her brother Jojen's voice rang out. "Jon, Mira." They turned to see Jojen running toward them, his face pale and urgent. Scouts have spotted riders on the northern edge of the swamp. They're heavily armed, but their banners are unfamiliar. Jon's grip tightened on his sword. Unknown soldiers venturing this deep into the neck was a troubling sign. "Do they know we're here?" "Not yet," Jojen replied, "but they're close." Howland Reed emerged from the hall, his expression grim. "Jon, you and the dragon must stay hidden. If they find you..." Jon nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. The dragon was too large to hide easily, but the Crannogmen had prepared for this possibility. Together, they led the creature deeper into the swamp, to a hollow surrounded by dense vegetation and water. Ghost followed, silent and alert. Far to the south, the dungeons of King's Landing were as dark and suffocating as Ned Stark had imagined they would be. The air was damp, the stench of rot and despair thick enough to choke. Shackled to the wall, Ned sat in silence, his body battered from the Lannisters' rough treatment. Yet the pain of his wounds was nothing compared to the torment of his thoughts. Robert Baratheon was dead, killed by a boar during a hunt orchestrated by Lannister scheming. His so-called son, Joffrey, now sat the Iron Throne, though Ned knew the boy to be the product of Cersei's incestuous relationship with her brother Jaime. His attempt to expose the truth had led to his imprisonment, branded a traitor to the crown. But it wasn't his own fate that haunted him. It was the safety of his family. Catelyn and the children were in Winterfell, vulnerable to Lannister retribution. And then there was Jon. Jon and his dragon. Ned had done everything he could to keep the boy safe, sending him to Howland Reed, the only man he trusted with the secret of Jon's parentage. Yet he couldn't help but wonder if it had been enough. If the Lannisters, or worse, Robert's old allies, discovered Jon's true identity, they would hunt him to the ends of the earth. Shifting against the cold stone wall, Ned closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer. Whatever the cost, Jon must remain hidden. The boy's future, and perhaps the fate of Westeros, depended on it. Back in Greywater Watch, Jon crouched beside his dragon, stroking its neck as it let out a low, rumbling purr. The creature had been restless since the scouts had reported the soldier's presence, its wings twitching and its eyes scanning the swamp as if sensing danger. "You need a name," Jon murmured. "Something that suits you." The dragon tilted its head, watching him intently. Jon thought of the stories old Nan used to tell by the fire, the legends of the Age of Heroes, of the Long Night and the great warriors who had fought against the darkness. One name lingered in his mind. "Valnir," Jon said softly. "It means guardian of light in the old tongue. What do you think?" The dragon let out a sharp cry, its wings flaring briefly. Jon smiled. "Valnir it is." As night fell, the Crannog men prepared for the possibility of confrontation. Howland gathered his people, their weapons and traps ready should the soldiers discover Greywater Watch. Jon, against Howland's wishes, refused to stay hidden. "If they come, I'll fight," Jon said. "I won't cower while others protect me." Howland regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "You have your father's spirit, but be careful, Jon. You carry more than your own life on your shoulders." The tension in the air was palpable as the hours dragged on. Ghost and Valnir stood beside Jon, both creatures alert and ready. But as dawn broke, the scouts returned with good news. The soldiers had retreated, their search fruitless. Relief swept through Greywater Watch, but Jon knew this was only the beginning. The world beyond the swamp was changing, and he would not be able to stay hidden forever. Later that day, a raven arrived, its black feathers glistening with dew. Howland Reed read the message in silence, his expression growing darker with each word. Finally, he looked up at Jon, his voice grave. "Your father has been imprisoned in King's Landing. Your brother Robb is raising the banners of the North." Jon's breath caught, a storm of emotion surging through him. Anger, fear, and a fierce determination. But before he could respond, Howland placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You must choose your path carefully, Jon Snow." Jon stared into the distance, the swamp's mist swirling like ghosts around him. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and though his heart burned with resolve, the road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. Jon paced the stone floor of the great hall at Greywater Watch, his face a storm of determination. Howland Reed sat at the table, his calm demeanour a stark contrast to Jon's restless energy. "I need to go to him," Jon insisted. "Robb is my brother. He's marching south, raising the banners of the North. He'll need every sword, and I won't sit here while he fights alone." Howland sighed, setting down the parchment he had been studying. "You're not thinking clearly, Jon. Your dragon is too young, untested. If you go now, you'll be more of a target than an asset. Do you understand what the Lannisters would do if they discovered you and your dragon?" Jon's hands clenched into fists. "You think I'm afraid? I'm not a child. Robb needs me. The North needs me." Howland rose from his seat, his sharp green eyes locking with Jon's. "The North already has Robb. He has the loyalty of every house, every sword. You are more valuable here, alive and hidden. Your time will come, Jon Snow, but it is not now. Jon's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched until Howland placed a hand on his shoulder. Trust me, Jon. I knew your father well. He'd want you to be patient. Robb's war is not yours to fight. Not yet. Reluctantly, Jon nodded. He turned away, the fire in his chest replaced by a heavy ache. Valnir, as if sensing his turmoil, rumbled softly from his corner of the hall. The dragon's piercing blue eyes followed Jon as he walked away. In the dungeons of King's Landing, Ned Stark's resolve was crumbling. The damp, suffocating air gnawed at his spirit, but it was the weight of his thoughts that crushed him most. He had learned of Sansa's precarious position as Joffrey's hostage, and Arya's disappearance into the city. But it was the image of Jon and his dragon, alone, vulnerable and hunted, that haunted him most. Ned's choices were few. He could only protect his family by sacrificing his honor. For them, he would do it. Summoned before the court, Ned stood tall despite his chains. His voice rang out, steady and unbroken, as he confessed his treason. I plotted to usurp the throne, he lied, each word tasting of ash. I betrayed my king, Robert Baratheon. Cersei's satisfied smirk and Joffrey's cruel grin burned into his memory as he spoke, but the promise of exile, of seeing the wall once more, made it bearable. Yet, as the crowd's jeers grew louder, Joffrey's shrill voice cut through the noise. Bring me his head. Ned's heart sank. In his final moments, he thought not of his own fate, but of his children. Jon, he whispered, as the executioner's blade fell. Weeks later, the news of Ned Stark's execution reached Greywater Watch. Jon stood frozen as Howland delivered the words. The room seemed to tilt, his world cracking apart. He confessed, Howland said softly, but Joffrey had him executed anyway. Jon's breath came in ragged bursts. You told me to stay. You said Robb didn't need me. If I'd gone, maybe. His voice broke, his anger and grief boiling over. Maybe I could have saved him. Howland's expression hardened. And what would you have done? Challenged the Lannisters with a dragon that cannot yet fly? Raised your sword against the might of the South? You'd be dead, Jon, or worse, captured. Jon's fist trembled at his sides. He was my father. He was my friend, Howland said, his voice steady but sorrowful. We all loved him. If you throw your life away now, what will his sacrifice mean? Jon's shoulders slumped. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by an aching resignation. I'm sorry, he muttered. You're right. Howland's expression softened too. Robb will need you one day, Jon. We must be ready when that time comes. The year that followed was one of relentless preparation. Jon threw himself into his training, mastering the Crannoc men's techniques and forging bonds with their people. Howland's warriors learned to adapt to Valnir's growing presence, crafting strategies that combined their swamp-born cunning with the dragon's burgeoning power. Valnir's growth was astonishing. The dragon's wings stretched wide, its body sleek and muscular. Its scales gleamed like freshly fallen snow, streaked with silver that caught the light. Its breath, no longer the frosty chill of its youth, now unleashed searing flames, capable of reducing trees to ash and melting steel, yet it had not yet taken to the skies. One crisp morning, Jon stood before Valnir, the swamp's mist curling around them. The dragon's eyes met his, and for the first time, Jon felt not just the bond of kinship, but an understanding. It's time, Jon said, his voice steady. He climbed onto Valnir's back, gripping the ridges along its neck. The dragon shifted beneath him, its powerful muscles coiling with anticipation. Ghost watched silently, his head tilted as if in approval. Fly, Valnir, Jon commanded. With a mighty roar, the dragon leapt into the air. Its wings beat against the wind, and for a moment, Jon's heart leapt with the fear of falling. But then they rose higher, the swamp receding below them as the sky opened up. The rush of the wind, The sheer exhilaration of flight filled Jon's senses. He laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed through the clouds. For the first time since leaving Winterfell, he felt free. As Valnir soared over the neck, Jon's thoughts turned to Robb, to the north, and to the war that lay ahead. The dragon's wings carried him forward, and for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever destiny awaited him. Below him, the Crannogmen emerged from the dense mists of the swamp, their faces upturned in awe. 2,000 strong, they stood in formation, warriors clad in leather and reeds, their weapons glinting in the pale sunlight. A collective cheer rose from the crowd, a thunderous roar that matched the dragon's cry. Jon Snow, they called, their voices echoing through the marshlands. The Dragon of the North. Jon guided Valnir into a sweeping circle above them, the dragon's massive shadow passing over the gathered host. It was a sight to behold. The proud warriors of the Neck, saluting their newest warrior, a bond forged not by birthright, but by fire and resolve. Jon raised his sword high, its steel catching the light, and the cheers grew louder. For the first time, Jon saw the army Howland Reed had quietly assembled. These were not just soldiers, they were his people now, bound by a common purpose. The weight of leadership settled on his shoulders, but it was not a burden, it was a calling. The Crannogmen roared their approval as Valnir climbed higher into the sky. Jon looked to the horizon where the north awaited. His path was clear, his resolve unshakable. The dragon beneath him was not just a weapon, but a symbol of what was to come, a union of fire, frost, and the unyielding strength of the north. The swamp's morning mist clung to the air like a shroud as Jon Snow stood in the clearing, his hand resting on the cool, silver-white scales of Valnir. The dragon's chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm, its piercing blue eyes locked on Jon as if sensing the weight of his thoughts. Around them, the Crannogmen moved with quiet efficiency, sharpening blades, mending armor, preparing for the day ahead. The air was thick with purpose, but Jon's mind was elsewhere. Again, Jon commanded, stepping back. Valnir responded with a guttural growl, a plume of smoke escaping its nostrils. The dragon reared back, its wings unfurling to their full, awe-inspiring span, and unleashed a torrent of flame that engulfed the row of wooden dummies before them. The heat was intense, and the dummies disintegrated into ash within moments. The Crannogmen watching nearby murmured in awe. "Good," Jon said, his voice steady. He raised his sword, pointing to the sky. "Now fly." Valnir's wings beat the air with a thunderous whoosh, and it leapt into the sky, climbing higher and higher until it was but a silver speck against the clouds. Jon watched intently, his heart swelling with pride and determination. His bond with his dragon had grown stronger with each passing day, and he knew they were nearing the moment when they would no longer need to train in isolation, but unleash their might upon the battlefield. The sound of wings brought Valnir back to the ground, its landing shaking the earth beneath Jon's boots. He placed a hand on his dragon's snout, feeling the warmth emanating from it. "Soon," Jon murmured, almost to himself. "Soon." A sharp cry from above broke the moment. A raven swooped down, its dark feathers glinting in the pale sunlight. It landed on the outstretched arm of a Crannogman, who quickly brought it to Howland Reed. The Lord of Greywater Watch untied the message with nimble fingers, his expression growing grim as he read. "What is it?" Jon asked, stepping forward. Howland looked up, his green eyes meeting Jon's. "A message from Robb. He's heading to the twins for Edmure Tully's wedding. He's hoping to secure the Frey's loyalty." Jon's brow furrowed. "The Freys? After they abandoned him at the start of the war? This is desperation." Howland nodded, his voice low. "It is. The Lannisters' stranglehold grows tighter with each passing day. Robb's victories in the field mean little if he cannot hold his alliances together. This marriage is a gamble, and one he cannot afford to lose. Jon's hand tightened into fists. We can't stand by any longer. Robb is my brother, and the North is bleeding. If we wait, it will be too late. Howland's face was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Finally, he sighed, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. You're right. We have stayed in the shadows long enough. If Robb falls, the North falls, and if the North falls, all is lost. Jon placed a hand on Howland's shoulder. Then it's time. Gather the men. We march south to the Twins. Robb needs to see the strength of the neck and the power of Vale. Howland nodded solemnly. So be it. Word spread quickly through Greywater Watch. The Crannogmen, stoic and resilient, assembled with a quiet determination. 2,000 strong, they stood ready, their weapons gleaming and their resolve unshakable. Howland Reed addressed them from atop a raised platform, his voice carrying over the crowd. For years, we have defended the neck, keeping our people safe while the South bled. But the time has come to take up arms for more than our swamps. The North calls to us, and we will answer. Robb Stark fights for our freedom, for our families, and for the honor of the North. Now, we march to join him. Together, we will show the South the strength of the neck. A cheer rose from the assembled warriors, their voices echoing through the marshlands. Jon stepped forward, Vale towering behind him. The dragon let out a deafening roar, its wings spreading wide, casting a massive shadow over the crowd. You have waited in the shadows for too long, Jon said, his voice strong and clear. But no longer. The time has come to fight. The North will rise again, and we will lead the charge. Together, with Vale, we will make the South tremble. The Crannogmen roared their approval, their spirits unbreakable. They began their march south, moving through the dense swamps with practiced ease. Jon rode at the forefront, Vale flying overhead, a symbol of hope and power for all who followed. The march was grueling but swift. The Crannogmen's knowledge of the terrain allowed them to bypass enemy patrols and avoid detection. Vale's presence deterred any would-be attackers, the dragon's shadow a constant reminder of the power they carried. As they neared the Twins, Jon and Howland rode side by side. Do you think Walder Frey can be trusted? Jon asked. Howland's expression darkened. Frey is a snake. His loyalty lies with himself and his own ambition. But Robb has no choice. He must secure the Frey's support if he is to hold the Riverlands. Jon nodded grimly. Then we must be there to ensure he doesn't stand alone. Vale will make an impression Walder Frey won't soon forget. Howland pulled his horse to a halt. No, Jon. Vale must remain hidden until the moment is right. A dragon appearing unannounced will send shockwaves through the hall. We'll use that shock to our advantage. Jon hesitated, but he knew Howland was right. Very well, I'll stay back with Vale, but signal me when it's time. As the Crannogmen approached the Twins, the imposing towers loomed against the darkening sky. The sound of drums and the murmur of voices carried over the river, the Frey's festivities already underway. Howland Reed took a small contingent of men and approached the gates, leaving the main force hidden in the marshes beyond. Frey guards eyed them warily, but ultimately opened the gates, their suspicion tempered by Howland's calm demeanour. Inside, the courtyard buzzed with activity. Frey soldiers milled about, their laughter and drunken boasts masking an undercurrent of tension. Howland entered the great hall, its long tables laden with food and drink. The Freys were in high spirits, their crude humour and raucous laughter filling the room. At the high table, Robb Stark sat beside Walder Frey, his young queen by his side. The king in the North's face was drawn, his attempts at civility masking the weight of his decisions. Spotting Howland, Robb rose, his eyes lighting up with surprise and relief. "Lord Reed," he said, stepping forward, "you honour us with your presence." Howland bowed slightly. "Your Grace, I bring 2,000 Crannogmen, ready to fight for the North." Robb's expression softened, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Howland. Your support means more than you know." Howland leaned in, his voice low. "There is more, your grace. I have brought—" A sharp clang of a spoon against a goblet interrupted him. Walder Frey rose slowly from his seat, his presence commanding the room's attention. "My lords and ladies," Frey began, his voice dripping with false geniality. "A toast to King Robb and his lovely queen. May their union bring peace to the realm." The doors to the hall creaked shut behind him, their heavy thud echoing ominously. Howland's eyes flicked to the doors, then to Robb, a sense of foreboding settling in his chest. Outside in the darkened marshes, Valnir stirred restlessly, sensing the unease in its rider. Jon stood at the ready, his hand on his sword, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the twins. The air was heavy with anticipation, the calm before the storm. The night had turned into a symphony of screams and steel. In the great hall of the twins, chaos reigned. The Red Wedding, as it would come to be known, had begun. Northern soldiers, unarmed and caught unaware, were slaughtered where they sat. Walder Frey stood at the high table, a cruel smile twisting his wrinkled face as his men turned on their guests. Crossbows fired from the balconies, their bolts raining death upon Robb Stark's loyal followers. Tables overturned, and the once joyous feast became a slaughterhouse. Robb Stark, bloodied and clutching at his side where a bolt had struck him, tried to rally his men, but the Freys outnumbered them. His wife, Talisa, lay dead at his feet, her lifeless eyes staring up at the timbered ceiling. The king in the north roared in grief and fury, but it was a futile attempt. The doors were locked, and the hall was a death trap. Howland Reed, standing near the centre of the room, fought valiantly. His crannogmen who had accompanied him had drawn their blades, cutting down Frey soldiers wherever they could, but they too were overwhelmed. Howland found himself surrounded, his blade flashing in the dim light as he fought to the last. A spear found its way past his defences, piercing his chest. He fell to his knees, blood bubbling from his lips. His final thoughts were of his family in the neck, and of Jon Snow, waiting in the darkness beyond the twins. Outside, hidden in the marshes, Jon Snow's heart pounded. The sounds of music had turned to muffled shouts and screams. Valnir, the silver-white dragon, shifted restlessly beside him, its piercing blue eyes scanning the horizon. The crannogmen around Jon looked uneasy, their hands on their weapons as they waited for orders. Something was wrong. Jon turned to the closest scout. "What do you see?" The crannogman adjusted his spyglass, his face pale. "The gates are closed. There's smoke rising. And the screams, my lord. It's a massacre." Jon's jaw tightened. He looked towards the twins, his heart sinking. "Robb," he whispered. Then louder he shouted, "Arm yourselves. We march now." The crannogmen moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons glinting in the faint light. Jon climbed onto Valnir's back, the dragon's body radiating heat beneath him. He drew his sword, its steel catching the light of the moon. "For the north," he roared, and Valnir let out a deafening cry, its wings beating as it launched into the sky. The crannogmen surged forward, their war cries echoing across the marshes as they charged towards the twins. Valnir descended upon the twins like a storm. The dragon's roar split the night, freezing Frey soldiers in their tracks. Its jaw opened, releasing a torrent of fire that engulfed the outer gates. Wood and stone alike crumbled under the assault, and the Freys stationed atop the walls were incinerated in seconds. Jon directed Valnir toward the courtyard, where Frey soldiers had begun to organise against the sudden attack. The dragon landed with a thunderous crash, its claws tearing into the earth. Valnir unleashed another blast of flame, scattering the enemy like leaves in the wind. The crannogmen poured through the shattered gates, their spears and daggers finding gaps in the Frey's armour. The northern soldiers trapped within the twins heard the commotion outside and seized the opportunity. Those who had managed to arm themselves fought back with renewed vigour, their spirits lifted by the sight of the dragon, raining death upon their attackers. Jon leapt from Valnir's back, landing amidst the chaos. He cut down a Frey soldier with a single, powerful stroke of his sword. "For the north," he shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. The sight of Jon Snow, clad in black and wielding steel, leading the charge with a dragon at his back, was enough to send many of the Freys fleeing. The battlefield was a chaotic swirl of fire, steel and blood, but the tide had turned. Jon and the Crannogmen fought their way into the Great Hall, the doors splintered and smoking from Valnir's assault. Inside, the scene was grim. Bodies littered the floor, and blood pooled beneath overturned tables. Jon's eyes scanned the room, locking onto the high table where Robb Stark lay slumped. "Robb!" Jon shouted, rushing forward. The king in the north looked up, his face pale and blood-streaked. He managed a weak smile. "Jon, you're here." Jon dropped to his knees beside his brother, cradling him gently. "I'm here. Hold on." Robb shook his head, coughing weakly. "It's too late for me. The North needs a leader, someone they can follow, someone they can believe in." Tears filled Jon's eyes as Robb gripped his hand. "You're my brother, Jon. Not by blood, but in every way that matters. The North is yours now. Lead them." "I'll make them pay, Robb," Jon swore, his voice breaking. "For you, for the North." Robb smiled faintly. "I know you will." His hand fell limp, and the light faded from his eyes. Jon closed his brother's eyes, his grief replaced by a burning fury. He stood, his gaze falling upon Walder Frey and Roose Bolton, who had been captured by the Crannogmen. Walder Frey, trembling, sneered through his fear. "You can't kill me. I'm lord of this." Jon silenced him with a swing of his sword, the blade cutting cleanly through the old man's neck. Frey's head hit the ground with a sickening thud. And then he turned to Roose Bolton, who stood defiant, even in chains. "You betrayed your king," Jon said coldly. "The North remembers." Bolton's calm facade cracked as Valnir's growl filled the hall. Jon didn't wait for an answer. His sword found Bolton's heart, and the traitor crumpled to the floor. The dawn broke over the twins, casting its light on the battlefield littered with the dead and dying. The Frey banners were torn down, replaced by the direwolf of House Stark. The surviving northern soldiers gathered in the courtyard, their faces weary but determined. Jon stood before them, Valnir at his back, his sword raised high. "Robb Stark is dead," he announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But his fight is not over. The North will have its vengeance. We will make the Lannisters and their allies pay for their treachery. We will burn them to ash." A cheer rose from the assembled soldiers, their cries of the king in the north echoing through the ruins of the twins. Jon looked out over his people, the weight of his new title settling on his shoulders. He had been thrust into this role by tragedy, but he would not falter. With Valnir by his side and the North behind him, Jon Snow would rise to meet the challenges ahead. The fire of vengeance burned within him, and the Lannisters would soon learn the fury of the dragon and the wolf. The sun had barely risen over the ruined fortress of the twins. Its pale light illuminated the blood-soaked battleground, casting long shadows over the shattered remains of House Frey. Jon Snow stood atop the walls, Valnir's immense form perched behind him. The dragon's silver-white scales shimmered in the dawn, a stark contrast to the carnage below. The banners of House Stark now flew over the castle, a reminder to all who gazed upon them that the North endured. In the great hall, Jon convened with the surviving northern leaders. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, but the mood was resolute. Great Jon Umber, his massive frame still bearing the scars of recent battles, stood near the hearth, his deep voice booming as he recounted tales of Frey treachery. Edmure Tully, newly freed from Frey captivity, sat at the high table, his face weary but his eyes sharp. Other northern lords, bannermen and crannogmen filled the hall, their attention fixed on Jon. Jon rose from his seat, the room falling silent as he began to speak. My lords, the Red Wedding was meant to break us. It was meant to end our cause, but we are still here. Robb Stark may be gone, but his dream of a free North lives on in each of us. His voice was firm, carrying the weight of his grief and determination. We now hold the Twins, he continued, but our position is precarious. Our army is down to 14,000 men, and the Lannisters will not let our defiance go unanswered. We must act swiftly and decisively. Jon turned to Great Jon Umber. You will take a force north to retake Winterfell from the Ironborn. Rally every able-bodied man and women loyal to the Starks. The North must rise again. Great Jon pounded his chest with a massive fist. Winterfell will be ours, my lord. The North remembers. Jon nodded, then turned to Edmure Tully. Edmure, you know the Riverlands better than anyone. Rally the River Lords to our cause. Hold River Run and the Twins. If the Lannisters march north, they must face the combined strength of the Riverlands and the North. Edmure's jaw tightened as he nodded. I will see it done, Jon. The Riverlands will stand with you. The gathered lords murmured their approval, but one voice rose above the rest. And what of you, Jon Snow? Asked Lady Mormont, her young but fierce voice unwavering. What will you do? Jon's gaze swept the room. I will go east to the Vale and secure the support of the Knights of the Vale. With their strength and Valnir by my side, we will march south to Harrenhal, a key stronghold that can serve as our staging ground. From there we will bring fire and blood to the Lannisters. Murmurs rippled through the hall, but it was Lady Mormont who broke the silence again. And what of the dragon, my lord? How is it you command such a creature? Jon took a deep breath, his voice steady as he revealed his secret. I am not the son of Eddard Stark. I am the son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. The blood of the dragon flows in my veins. The room erupted in shock and confusion. Lords shouted over one another, their voices a mix of disbelief and awe. Jon raised a hand, silencing them. I was raised as a Stark and will always be one. But my Targaryen blood has given me this. He gestured to Valnir, whose massive head loomed outside the hall's shattered window. When I found the dragon egg, I didn't know what it would become. Now I see it as a gift from the gods, meant to aid us in our darkest hour. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the gathered lords. Slowly, they nodded, their initial shock replaced by renewed determination. The sight of Valnir had already inspired awe and fear. Jon's revelation only cemented his position as a leader unlike any other. We have much to do, Jon said, but with your strength and loyalty, we will see the North rise again. Edmure, Great Jon, go to your tasks. When the time comes, we will march together to reclaim what is ours. The lords voiced their agreement, their cheers echoing through the hall. Just as Jon was about to dismiss them, a soldier entered, his face pale and urgent. My lord, the soldier said, we found 2 people outside the castle. One of them claims to be Arya Stark. Jon's heart stopped. The hall grew silent as he stepped forward. Bring them in, he commanded. The doors swung open, and Arya Stark stepped into the hall. Her face was gaunt, her clothes torn and dirty, but her grey eyes burned with fierce determination. Beside her stood a hulking figure, clad in battered armour. Sandor Clegane, the Hound. Jon crossed the room in long strides, his voice breaking as he called out, Arya! He pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. "Jon," Arya whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought I'd never see you again." Jon pulled back, his hands on her shoulders. "You're safe now. I swear to you, Arya. We will avenge Mother. We will avenge Robb." Arya's lips curled into a fierce smile. "Good. I want to see them all suffer." Jon turned to the Hound, his expression hard. "And you?" Arya interjected. "He protected me. Without him, I wouldn't be here." Jon's gaze softened as he addressed the Hound. "Thank you. If there's a price, name it. I'll see that you're paid." The Hound grunted. "Aye, there's a price. Coin will do fine." Jon nodded, signalling for a pouch of gold to be brought forward. As it was handed to the Hound, Jon hesitated. "Do you need work? We could use a man like you." The Hound smirked. "I've seen what you've got outside. That dragon of yours? I might stick around, if only to see what kind of trouble you stir up." Jon extended his hand. "Then welcome to the fight." The Hound took it with a firm grip. "Don't make me regret this, Snow." Jon turned back to the gathered lords, his voice rising. "We have lost much, but we are not broken. The North will rise, and the Lannisters will pay for their treachery. Together, we will see justice done. For the North, for House Stark." The hall erupted in cheers, their cries echoing through the twins as Jon Snow stood tall, a dragon behind him and the North at his back. The flight to the Eyrie was both serene and exhilarating. The winds of the Vale swirled around Jon Snow as he gripped the saddle on Valnir's back. The dragon's powerful wings beat against the cold mountain air, each stroke propelling them higher and closer to the impregnable fortress of House Arryn. Below, the sheer cliffs of the Vale stretched out like jagged teeth, and Jon marvelled at how the stronghold had endured untouched by war. As Valnir soared over the gates of the moon, the great castle of the Eyrie came into view. Its 7 white towers rose majestically from the mountain peak, surrounded by a clear sky tinged with the pink hues of late afternoon. Horns blared from the walls, and Jon saw the garrison scramble to prepare for his arrival. The sight of a dragon approaching had clearly thrown the guards into chaos. Valnir descended gracefully onto the wide courtyard, his talons scraping against the stone as he landed. Soldiers and servants scattered, their eyes wide with fear and awe. Jon slid from the saddle, his boots landing heavily on the ground. He turned to stroke Valnir's neck, whispering calming words to the beast before stepping forward. A delegation emerged from the keep, led by Lady Lysa Arryn. She wore a flowing gown of pale blue and silver, her hair braided intricately, but her expression was pinched with both suspicion and nervousness. Beside her stood her sworn sword, along with a maester and several knights of the Vale. At her side was her young son, Robin Arryn, his slight frame dwarfed by the ornate doublet he wore. "Jon Snow," Lysa called out, her voice wavering slightly as her gaze darted between him and Valnir. "You bring a dragon to my gates. What is the meaning of this?" Jon stepped forward, bowing respectfully. "Lady Arryn, I come as a friend and ally, seeking the aid of the Knights of the Vale. The North stands against the tyranny of the Lannisters, and we need your strength to bring justice to the realm." Lysa's lips tightened. "Justice? And what justice will there be for my sister, Catelyn Stark? She was betrayed, slaughtered at the Twins along with her son. You come here with talk of war, but war has already cost my family everything." Her voice cracked and she turned away, clutching Robin's arm. The boy's eyes, wide and curious, were fixed on Valnir. "Lady Arryn," Jon said, stepping closer, "the Red Wedding was a betrayal that shook us all. I loved Catelyn as my own mother, and Robb Stark was my brother in all but blood. Their deaths demand justice, but justice cannot be won without strength. The North has endured terrible losses, but we are far from defeated. We hold the Twins, and the Riverlands are rallying to our cause. With the Knights of the Vale, we can end the Lannisters' reign of terror." Lysa turned back to him, her face pale. "The Knights of the Vale are my son's inheritance. I will not risk them in a war that cannot be won." Jon's voice grew firmer, passion igniting in his words. "This war can be won, my lady. The North remembers, and we rise stronger each day. We have 14,000 men in the field, and more rallying to our banners. At Harrenhal, we will gather our forces and march south. The Lannisters' armies are stretched thin, fighting battles on all sides. With your knights, we can strike a decisive blow." He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled knights. "And I do not stand alone." He gestured toward Valnir, who raised his massive head and let out a low, rumbling growl that echoed through the courtyard. "With a dragon by our side, no army can stand against us. The Vale has a chance to be part of a great victory, to bring honour and justice to the realm." The knights murmured amongst themselves, their faces alight with excitement. Lady Lysa's sworn sword stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Lady Arryn, with respect, the boy speaks true. The Knights of the Vale are the finest in Westeros. We cannot stand idle while the realm burns." Other knights echoed his sentiment, their voices growing louder. Robin Arryn, who had remained silent until now, suddenly stepped forward. His pale face was flushed, and his hands trembled slightly, but his voice was clear. "Mother," Robin said, "I want to fight. I want the Vale to be remembered as the force that brought peace to Westeros." Lysa's eyes widened in shock. "Robin, you do not understand. I understand enough," Robin interrupted, his voice steady. "You've always told me the Vale is strong, that we are the true protectors of the realm. If we do nothing, we are cowards. I don't want to be a coward." The courtyard fell silent, all eyes on Lysa, her expression twisted with conflict, her lips trembling as she searched for words. Finally, she turned to Jon, her voice barely above a whisper. "Very well," she said. "The Knights of the Vale will march. But if this war brings ruin upon us, the blame will rest on your shoulders, Jon Snow." Jon bowed deeply. "You have my word, Lady Arryn. Together, we will see this war ended." The courtyard erupted in cheers as the knights raised their swords, their voices ringing with renewed purpose. Jon stepped back to Valnir, his heart swelling with relief and determination. As he climbed onto the dragon's back, he looked down at the assembled soldiers and lords of the Vale. "Prepare your banners," he called out. "The North and the Vale will march as one." Valnir let out a thunderous roar, lifting into the sky with a powerful leap. From above, Jon watched as the Knights of the Vale began to mobilize. Thousands of men in shining armor gathered in formation, their banners, the moon and falcon of House Arryn, fluttering in the mountain winds. And at their head stood Robin Arryn, his boyish face set with determination as he watched Jon ascend. The army began its march, winding down the narrow passes of the Vale, a glittering river of steel and purpose. Valnir flew low over the column, his shadow stretching across the mountainside. The soldiers below cheered and raised their swords, their cries echoing in the peaks. Jon looked ahead, the horizon stretching wide and full of possibility. The Vale had answered his call, and with their strength, the tide of war had turned. The North had risen, and now the Vale would follow. Together, they would bring justice to the Lannisters and restore honour to the realm. As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting the land in shades of gold and crimson, Jon's resolve burned brighter than ever. Valnir roared once more, a sound that carried across the Vale, a herald of the storm to come. The cold winds of the Riverlands swept across the sprawling ruins of Harrenhal as Jon Snow descended from the sky atop Valnir. The dragon's massive wings beat against the air, scattering leaves and dust as soldiers below shielded their eyes. The Knights of the Vale rode in disciplined columns, their moon and falcon banners fluttering in the breeze, while the northern and Riverland forces stood at attention, their faces a mix of relief and apprehension. Jon leapt from Valnir's saddle, landing with practiced ease. Lysa Arryn's sworn sword dismounted nearby, his face pale but determined. "We've arrived just in time," Jon muttered to him as he surveyed the scene. The castle's massive walls loomed around them, their charred stone a grim reminder of past sieges. The courtyard buzzed with activity as men scrambled to fortify positions, but the disorganization was evident. A scout rushed forward, his face drawn with exhaustion. "My lord," the scout said, bowing hastily, "the castle is barely manned. We've only just arrived, and the defences are incomplete. Worse still, a Lannister army is upon us. They'll be here by nightfall. It seems they were forewarned of our movements." Jon's expression darkened. "A spy in the Vale," he growled. "No matter. We'll hold Harrenhal. Spread the word. All men to their posts. Prepare for battle." The scout saluted and dashed off. Jon turned to Robin and the gathered knights. "This castle has withstood fire and blood before. It will do so again. The Lannisters think they have us cornered, but we have something they don't. Valnir." He glanced at the dragon who crouched nearby, his silver-white scales glinting ominously. "When the time comes, we'll show them what it means to face the north." The knights nodded, their fear tempered by Jon's resolve. He strode to the ramparts, where Great Jon Umber and Edmure Tully awaited him. "The men are readying as best they can," Great Jon rumbled, his broad shoulders tense. "But Harrenhal's too damned big. We don't have enough men to cover every wall." "We'll focus our defences on the main gates and key choke points," Jon replied. "The Lannisters will be forced to spread themselves thin if they try to surround us. It'll buy us time." Edmure stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "And if they breach the rules?" Jon's jaw tightened. "Then we fight in the courtyards, the halls and the towers. We make them pay for every step. But trust me, they won't breach these walls without a fight they'll never forget." The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the battlefield as the Lannister army arrived in full force. Tens of thousands of men, in crimson and gold, spread out in disciplined formations, their siege engines looming behind them like harbingers of doom. At the head of the host rode Tywin Lannister, his golden army gleaming in the dying light. The northern soldiers and the Riverlanders stood ready, their weapons gleaming under the fading sun. The Knights of the Vale formed a reserve force in the castle's heart, their polished armour a stark contrast to the rough-hewn gear of the north. Jon moved among the ranks, his presence a steadying force. He paused before a group of young archers, their hands trembling on their bowstrings. "Steady," Jon said, his voice calm but firm. "The Lannisters want you to fear them, but remember this. They've never faced a dragon. Hold your ground, aim true, and trust in your brothers beside you." The archers nodded, their resolve hardening. Jon turned and ascended the walls, where Valnir perched like a living shadow, his golden eyes fixed on the approaching enemy. "Soon," Jon murmured, running a hand along the dragon's scales. "Not yet. Let them think they're winning." The Lannister siege began with the thunder of catapults. Massive stones hurtled through the air, smashing into Harrenhal's walls and sending shards of stone raining down. Northern archers returned fire, their arrows darkening the sky as they sought out the enemy's front lines. Screams and shouts echoed across the battlefield as the first casualties fell. The Lannisters pressed forward, ladders and siege towers rolling towards the walls. Northern spearmen and archers held their ground, toppling the first wave with a rain of arrows and boiling oil. But the Lannisters were relentless, their sheer numbers pushing the defenders to their limits. Jon paced the ramparts, shouting orders. "Focus fire on the siege towers. Keep them off the walls." His voice cut through the chaos like a blade, rallying the weary defenders. Despite their efforts, a section of the outer wall began to buckle under the relentless assault. A battering ram smashed through the gates, and Lannister troops poured into the breach. The northern soldiers met them head-on, swords clashing in a chaotic melee. Jon's heart pounded as he saw the tide turning against his men. "Now," he said, mounting Valnir. The dragon's eyes blazed as Jon whispered a command. With a deafening roar, Valnir launched into the sky, his wings spreading wide as he soared over the battlefield. The sight of the dragon froze the Lannister army in their tracks. Soldiers looked up in terror as Valnir unleashed a torrent of fire.
the flames engulfing siege engines and scattering men like leaves in a storm. Screams filled the air as the inferno swept through the enemy ranks, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. From his vantage point, Tywin Lannister watched in grim silence. "The rumours were true," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "The North does have a dragon." Despite the destruction, Tywin's iron will held firm. He turned to his commanders. "Press forward. If we can breach the castle, the dragon will be useless. Jon Snow won't risk burning his own men." The Lannister forces rallied, their discipline holding even in the face of Valnyr's fury. They surged toward the breached gates, clashing with the northern defenders in a desperate push. The Knights of the Vale charged out to meet them, their lances gleaming as they thundered into the fray. The battlefield erupted into chaos as the two armies became entangled. From above, Jon watched the carnage, his keen eyes scanning for Tywin. He spotted the Lannister lord near the rear, surrounded by his guard. With a sharp command, he urged Valnyr into a steep dive. The dragon descended like a bolt of lightning, his flames cutting a swath through the Lannister ranks. Tywin turned just in time to see Valnyr bearing down on him. His face, usually a mask of cold control, twisted in fear as the dragon unleashed its fire. Tywin and his guards were consumed in an instant, the flames leaving only charred remains in their wake. The sight of their leader's demise shattered the Lannister army's resolve. Soldiers threw down their weapons, their once disciplined ranks dissolving into chaos. Jon circled the battlefield, his voice echoing as he shouted, "Lay down your weapons, and you will be spared. Resist and face my dragon's wrath." The surrender was swift. The Lannister soldiers dropped to their knees, their faces pale with terror. Jon guided Valnyr back to the castle, dismounting as his men erupted into cheers. Great Jon Umber clapped him on the back, his grin fierce. "We've done it, my lord. Harrenhal is ours." Jon raised a hand, silencing the celebration. "This is but one victory," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "The Lannisters will not recover from this blow, but their hold on the realm remains. We march next to King's Landing. The Iron Throne will fall, and justice will be ours." The soldiers roared their approval, their cries ringing out into the night. Valnyr let out a thunderous roar of his own, his wings spreading wide as if to embrace the promise of the battles to come. Jon Snow stood tall, his gaze fixed again on the horizon. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned, the North had risen, and with the strength of dragon fire and steel, they would see their enemies brought low. The throne room of the Red Keep was uncharacteristically silent, save for the quiet crackle of the torches lining the walls. Cersei Lannister sat near the Iron Throne, her golden hair cascading over her shoulders. Her face was a mask of carefully constructed composure, but her emerald eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. Beside her, Joffrey Baratheon, the boy king, fidgeted in the Iron Throne. His face was pale, his lips tight with the frustration of being left out of the real discussions that now determined his fate. The small council gathered before him. The silence broke as Varys, the ever-pragmatic master of whisperers, stepped forward, clutching a scroll in his delicate hands. "Your Grace, my Queen," Varys began, his voice smooth and measured. "I have received a raven from Harrenhal. It brings dire news." Cersei's knuckles tightened around the armrests of her chair. "Speak plainly, Varys. What's happened?" Varys's eyes flicked to the floor for a moment, a rare crack in his usual confidence. "The Lannister army has been defeated. Lord Tywin is dead." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Cersei's mask slipped, her face twisting in shock. Joffrey shot to his feet, his voice rising in anger. "Impossible," Joffrey shouted. "My grandfather cannot be defeated. He was the greatest military mind in Westeros, Who dares to stand against him? Varys's gaze shifted to Joffrey. Jon Snow, your grace, the Bastard of Winterfell. He commands an army of 40,000, and he rides a dragon. It was this dragon, Vale, that delivered the killing blow. Lord Tywin and his guards were consumed in dragonfire. Cersei's breath hitched. The words hung heavy in the air, almost suffocating. Tywin's death was unthinkable. He had been the backbone of House Lannister, the architect of their power. Without him, the weight of the family's survival now fell squarely on her shoulders. A dragon, Joffrey sneered, his voice cracking. That's nothing. We'll find a way to kill it. Archers, scorpions, wildfire. It doesn't matter. I am the king. They will kneel or burn. Tyrion Lannister, leaning casually against the council table with a goblet of wine in hand, chuckled darkly. Yes, nephew, because dragonfire worked out so well for the Targaryens' enemies in the past. Joffrey's face turned scarlet. Shut your mouth, imp. I am your king, and I will not be mocked. Tyrion's expression sobered, and he took a measured sip of wine before setting the goblet down. Your grace, he said, his tone now laced with grim seriousness. Your crown means little against a dragon. This northern army marches for King's Landing as we speak. Our forces are scattered. The Tyrells may still stand with us, but even their strength pales in comparison to what Jon Snow brings. And let's not forget, the Tyrells once fought for the Targaryens. A dragon in the north may remind them of old allegiances. Cersei's lips pressed into a thin line. You're saying we're doomed? Tyrion shrugged, his sharp eyes meeting hers. Not doomed. Not yet. But our options are limited. We cannot hope to defeat Jon Snow in open battle. Harrenhal has proved that. If we are to survive, we must consider unconventional solutions. What solutions? Cersei demanded, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. Flee, Tyrion said bluntly. Take the royal family to Essos. Secure allies there. Rumour has it that dragons are not as rare as they once were. If we can find one of our own, or forge alliances that rival the North's strength, we might return to reclaim the throne. Joffrey's hands clenched into fists. Flee? You're a coward, just like Father always said. I won't abandon my throne. I am the king, and I will crush anyone who dares to challenge me. Tyrion turned to Joffrey, his voice dripping with disdain. Your Majesty, the throne means nothing if you're dead. Do you truly believe the Northmen will spare you out of respect for your title? They'll hang your head on the gates of Winterfell to remind the world what happens to those who cross them. If you want to live, you will listen to reason. Cersei rose from the Iron Throne, stepping between her son and her brother. Her hand rested on Joffrey's shoulder, her grip firm. Tyrion is right, she said, her voice low but steady. This is not a retreat. It is a temporary measure. We will regroup, gather our strength, and return. But to do that, we must survive. Joffrey shook his head, his eyes wild with anger and fear. You're abandoning the throne. I am protecting my children, Cersei snapped, her voice cutting through his protests. The Lannister name will endure, but only if we live to fight another day. Do you understand me? Joffrey's defiance wavered under her gaze. Finally, he sank back into his chair, seething, but silent. Tyrion took a step closer to the council table. We'll need ships, provisions, and a destination. I suggest Pentos. The Magister there owes me a favour. Cersei nodded curtly. Make the arrangements. Quietly. If word gets out that we're abandoning King's Landing, the city will riot. As the council dispersed to carry out her orders, Cersei turned to Tyrion. Do not mistake my agreement for forgiveness. If we survive this, we will have words. Tyrion smirked faintly. I wouldn't dream of it, dear sister. As dawn broke over the Crownlands, Jon Snow rode at the head of his army. The massive host stretched for miles, a sea of banners bearing the direwolf of House Stark, the moon and falcon of the Vale, and the trout of House Tully. The morning sun glinted off their armour and weapons, casting a golden light over the determined faces of 40,000 men. Valnir soared above them, his silver-white scales shimmering like polished steel. The dragon's shadow passed over the land, a harbinger of the destruction to come. Soldiers glanced up with awe and fear, their morale bolstered by the presence of this mighty beast. Jon rode in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Beside him, Great Jon Umber grinned fiercely. "King's Landing won't know what hit him," he said, his voice booming with anticipation. "The city will fall," Jon said, his voice calm but resolute. "But we will not become what we seek to destroy. No innocent blood will be spilled." Edmure Tully rode up on Jon's other side. "The people of King's Landing have suffered enough under the Lannisters. If we show mercy, they may welcome us as liberators." Jon nodded. Mercy for the innocent, justice for the guilty. As they crested a hill, the sprawling city of King's Landing came into view. The red keep loomed in the distance, its towers piercing the sky like jagged spears. Smoke rose from the chimneys of countless homes, a stark contrast to the golden domes of the great sept of Baelor. Jon reined in his horse, his army halting behind him. He gazed at the city for a long moment before turning to his commanders. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying across the ranks. "The Lannisters have ruled through fear and treachery, but today we end their tyranny. We fight for the North, for the Riverlands, and for all those who have suffered under their rule. But remember, we are not here to destroy. We are here to rebuild, to bring honour back to the Seven Kingdoms." The soldiers cheered, their voices rising like a thunderclap. Valnir roared from above, his cries shaking the very earth. Jon drew his sword, the blade gleaming in the sunlight. "To victory," he said, spurring his horse forward. The army surged after him, a tidal wave of steel and fury. King's Landing awaited, its fate sealed by the fire and blood of the North. The sun rose over King's Landing, its golden rays casting a haunting light over the walls and towers of the city. What had once been the seat of power in Westeros now lay shrouded in eerie silence. At the city gates, Jon Snow rode at the head of his army, Valnir's massive form casting a shadow over the battlements. The dragon's silver-white scales glimmered, and his piercing eyes scanned the city below as if searching for hidden threats. Soldiers stood at the ready, their breaths visible in the cold morning air, their banners fluttering in the breeze. Jon dismounted his horse, his hand brushing against the hilt of his sword. Ghost trotted at his side, his red eyes gleaming with a feral intensity. Great Jon Umber, Edmure Tully, and Jon Royce approached, their expressions wary but resolute. "No sign of organised resistance," Royce said, scanning the walls with a practised eye. "The gates are barely guarded." "It's a trap," Umber growled, his massive hands gripping the pommel of his greatsword. "The lions won't give up their den so easily." "Perhaps not," Jon replied, his voice steady. "But we proceed cautiously. No unnecessary bloodshed. Signal Vanir to hold position over the city. The dragon alone will be enough to shake whatever resolve remains in their defenders." A horn blared, and the gates of King's Landing creaked open. Inside, a ragged group of city watchguards and Lannister soldiers stood in disarray. Their army was tarnished, their weapons poorly maintained, and their faces were pale with fear. One man, trembling, stepped forward and fell to his knees. "We surrender," he said, his voice shaking. "The Queen and the Boy King, they're gone. They left us behind." A murmur rippled through Jon's army. Umber spat on the ground. Cowards. They ran and left their people to face the storm. Jon raised a hand, silencing the growing noise. He stepped forward, his gaze piercing the kneeling man. You have chosen wisely. Lay down your weapons and you will not be harmed. Inform the rest of the city that any who surrender will be shown mercy. Anyone who resists will face the full wrath of the North. The defenders of King's Landing dropped their weapons without hesitation. Their relief was palpable. Jon turned to his men. Accept their surrender, he commanded. Secure the gates and ensure order in the city. No looting, no violence. We are here to end tyranny, not to replace it with chaos. The northern soldiers saluted and moved to carry out his orders. Jon mounted Valnir, the dragon's immense wings beating the air as they soared over the city. The sight of the dragon cowed any remaining thoughts of resistance. Smoke rose from scattered fires, but the city itself was largely intact. Jon landed in the courtyard of the Red Keep and dismounted, his boots crunching on the stone. Ghost padded beside him as he entered the castle. The Red Keep felt deserted. The grand halls echoed with their footsteps, the air thick with the scent of old smoke and abandonment. Jon pushed open the heavy doors to the small council chamber. The room was in disarray. Chairs overturned and papers scattered across the table. A goblet of wine lay spilled, its contents staining a nearby rug. Edmure and Royce joined him, their expressions grim. They left in a hurry, Edmure observed, picking up a discarded map marked with naval routes. Looks like they've fled by sea. Jon's brow furrowed as he surveyed the scene. His goal had been to bring justice to the Lannisters and liberate the city, but now that justice seemed just out of reach, he turned to his companions. The Lannisters are gone, he said, his voice low, but the city is ours. What now? Edmure stepped forward, his tone firm. Jon, the throne is yours. Jon's head snapped up, surprise evident on his face. The throne, he repeated. I did not march on King's Landing to claim the throne. I came to end Lannister rule and bring justice to the realm. Royce placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. Justice requires stability, my lord. You are the blood of Rhaegar Targaryen. Your claim to the throne is stronger than any other. Westeros needs a leader who can unite the realm. That leader is you. Jon shook his head, still reeling. I am a Stark. I have no desire for the Iron Throne. Edmure's voice softened. You are both, Jon. A Stark by upbringing, a Targaryen by blood. The North may not care for the Iron Throne, but the rest of Westeros will. If you refuse, the realm will descend into chaos. You are the only one who can prevent that. Jon's gaze swept the room, his mind racing. Finally, he sighed. If it is the will of the people, I will not refuse. But this is not a victory I sought, nor a burden I wanted. Edmure smiled. That is why you are the right choice. A true king does not seek power. He accepts it for the good of the realm. The room fell silent as Jon's advisors began planning his coronation. Royce spoke up. We cannot crown you as Jon Snow. A king needs a name worthy of his station. Edmure nodded. Jon Targaryen. It honours your heritage while keeping your given name, a symbol of unity between the North and the rest of Westeros. Jon hesitated, then nodded. So be it. Prepare the coronation. The coronation took place in the great sept of Baelor. The banners of House Stark, House Arryn, and House Tully draped the walls, a testament to the alliances that had brought this moment to fruition. Jon stood before the High Septon, clad in black and crimson robes, his sword at his side, and Ghost at his feet, a silent guardian. The High Septon raised a crown and placed it upon Jon's head. By the grace of the Seven, I crown you Jon Targaryen, first of your name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, protector of the realm. The hall erupted in cheers as Jon turned to face his people. His soldiers roared their approval, their voices echoing through the city. Valnir roared from above, his cries shaking the stones of the sept. Jon raised his sword high, a silent vow to rule with honour and justice. Far across the narrow sea, a Lannister ship docked in the ruins of Astapor. Cersei stood at the prow, her golden hair glinting in the sunlight. Joffrey sulked behind her, his expression petulant. Tyrion stood apart, his sharp eyes scanning the desolate harbour. "What is this place?" Joffrey demanded, his voice tinged with unease. "Astapor," Cersei replied. "Once a city of slave masters. We were to buy an army here." Tyrion's laughter was dry and bitter. "You might have missed the news, dear sister. Astapor no longer trades in slaves. Daenerys Targaryen saw to that." As the ship docked, the Lannisters disembarked, their boots crunching on the blood-stained stones. The city was a graveyard, its streets littered with the skeletal remains of the masters. Fires smouldered in the distance, and the stench of death lingered in the air. Cersei's expression hardened. "We'll find another way. The Lannisters are not finished." Tyrion's gaze lingered on the desolation. "Perhaps not, but neither is this Dragon Queen. And now there is another Targaryen on the throne. You'll find the world far less hospitable than you remember." Cersei's emerald eyes blazed with defiance. "Then we will adapt. A lion does not yield. We will reclaim what is ours." As they ventured deeper into the ruined city, the shadows seemed to close in around them. The Lannisters had escaped for now, but their path was fraught with peril. And in Westeros, Jon Targaryen sat upon the Iron Throne, the first of his name, his reign heralding a new age for the Seven Kingdoms. Months had passed since Jon Targaryen had taken the Iron Throne, and for the first time in years, Westeros had known peace. The North and the Riverlands were rebuilding, their lands scarred from war, but their people were determined to rise anew. The bulk of the Northern Alliance had returned home, their duties to the realm fulfilled. Yet the Game of Thrones never truly ended, and the Tyrells were ever eager to secure their influence. Marjorie Tyrell's hand in marriage had been offered now more than once, but Jon continued to delay. The weight of ruling the Seven Kingdoms was already a burden. Marriage was another chain he was not yet ready to wear. Jaime Lannister, once the golden lion of the Kingsguard, now sat in a well-kept chamber in the Red Keep. He was a prisoner, but a respected one. Jon had spared his life, knowing that the Lannisters would return, and Jaime would prove to be a valuable bargaining tool. The Kingslayer had not protested his captivity. Perhaps he too understood the game being played. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the small council chamber as Jon entered, Ghost padding silently at his side. Seated before him were the architects of his rule. Varys, still the master of whisperers, his spider's web stretching across the realm. Great Jon Umber, the master of war, a hulking force of loyalty. Edmure Tully, his hand, a steady voice of reason. Mace Tyrell, the master of ships, ever ambitious. And Lord Manderley, the master of coin, a shrewd financier with the North's best interests at heart. Jon took his seat at the head of the table. "Varys, any word of my sister Sansa?" His voice was steady, but concern lurked beneath. The eunuch bowed his head slightly. "Unfortunately, no one has seen Lady Sansa since the Lannisters fled the capital. It is feared that they took her with them. My little birds continue their search, but she remains elusive." Jon exhaled sharply. The thought of Sansa in the clutches of Cersei sent fury coursing through his veins. Double your efforts. I want every ship, every spy, and every informant searching for her. Varys inclined his head. It will be done, Your Grace. Edmure shifted in his seat. Jon, I know you are worried about Sansa, but we must speak of another matter. Stannis Baratheon. Jon's expression hardened. What of him? Great Jon Umber leaned forward. He still holds Dragonstone, and he refuses to acknowledge you as king. He has no real army after the Blackwater, but a desperate man can be dangerous. He will not bend the knee willingly. Jon frowned. I do not wish to start another war. I do not hate Stannis. Edmure sighed. You may not wish it, Your Grace, but Stannis is not the type to simply fade away. If given the chance, he will make his own claim again to the throne. Jon stood. His decision was made. Then I will go to Dragonstone myself. A stunned silence filled the chamber. You cannot be serious, Mace Tyrell said, his plump face contorted in disbelief. A king does not place himself in such danger. The great Jon shook his head. Aye, it's madness. Stannis is an honourable man, Jon countered. He will not strike me down if I come to talk, not fight. Varys, ever calm, studied Jon. You would risk much for diplomacy, Your Grace. Peace is worth the risk, Jon said simply. Prepare Valnir. I leave at dawn. As the first light of dawn touched the Red Keep, Valnir's massive wings unfurled, casting a shadow over King's Landing. With a powerful beat, the silver-white dragon lifted into the sky, carrying Jon northward. The sea churned beneath them as they neared Dragonstone, the ancient Targaryen stronghold. The castle loomed ahead, its obsidian towers rising like jagged fangs from the cliffs. Jon landed in the courtyard, dismounting smoothly as his boots hit the stone. Soldiers flanked the entrance, their hands on their weapons, but making no move to attack. The great doors creaked open, and there stood Stannis Baratheon, his face as stern as ever. So, the Bastard of Winterfell now calls himself king, Stannis said, his voice devoid of any warmth. But Jon met his gaze evenly. I am not here to fight you, Stannis. I am here to talk. The older man regarded him for a long moment before nodding. Then speak. Across the narrow sea, Meereen stood in the scorching heat of Essos. Within its walls, Cersei, Tyrion, Joffrey, and 100 Lannister soldiers had found refuge, if it could be called that. Tyrion had advised Cersei that brute force would not serve them here. They needed an ally, and there was only one woman in the world with the power to match Jon Targaryen. As they approached the Great Pyramid, Cersei's patience frayed. She sneered at the unsullied guards blocking their path. Take me to your queen, now. One of the soldiers did not even flinch. You will wait. The queen is not at your beck and call. Joffrey bristled. Do you know who I am? I am a boy far from his kingdom, came a voice from within. The doors parted, and Daenerys Targaryen stepped forward, flanked by her advisors. Her violet eyes assessed the newcomers with curiosity and caution. Tyrion bowed slightly. Your Grace, we come seeking an audience. We have much to discuss. Daenerys' lips curled into a wry smile. Indeed. The last time a Lannister served my family, he stabbed my father in the back. Tell me, why should I not burn you where you stand? Cersei stepped forward, her emerald eyes blazing. Because we have a common enemy. Jon Targaryen sits on the throne. I propose an alliance. A dangerous silence fell over the chamber before Daenerys chuckled softly. An alliance with the Lannisters. You must think me a fool. Tyrion interjected, his voice calm. Perhaps, but you may find that a common enemy makes for unlikely allies. Daenerys tilted her head, studying them. Perhaps, But first, tell me everything." As the Lannisters took their seats, the fate of Westeros hung in the balance. Jon Targaryen ruled in peace, but shadows lurked in the corners of the world, waiting for the moment to strike. The Game of Thrones was far from over. The obsidian towers of Dragonstone loomed overhead as the sea crashed violently against the cliffs. The air was thick with salt and smoke, and the torches lining the hall flickered as Jon Targaryen strode through the dimly lit corridors of the ancient fortress. Vale rested outside, his massive wings curled against his silver-white body, his eyes ever watchful. Jon had come alone. Yet the soldiers of Dragonstone remained on edge, their hands gripping swords and spears as Jon approached the war room. Inside, Stannis Baratheon stood like a statue, arms crossed over his chest, his expression as grim as the stormy skies outside. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Jon's, assessing, calculating. "So," Stannis said, his voice like grinding steel, "the Bastard of Winterfell arrives to parley." Jon met his gaze evenly. "I am not here as a bastard, nor as a usurper. I am here as a king, one who wishes to speak to you with the respect that you are due." Stannis gave a short, humourless laugh. "Respect? You sit on a throne I fought for, the throne that should have been mine, and now you wish to speak of respect." Jon did not rise to the bait. "I never sought the throne. After the Lannisters fled, there was chaos. The people needed a leader, and I had no choice but to take the burden upon myself. The realm needed stability. Duty demanded it of me." Stannis narrowed his eyes. Duty, a word often used by men to justify their ambitions. Jon sighed, his breath heavy with the weight of memory. "Do you know how I came to have my dragon?" he asked, changing the subject. Stannis regarded him warily. "Go on, speak your piece." Jon stepped forward, his voice steady. "When I first learned of my true heritage, that I was not the son of Ned Stark, but rather his nephew, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, I did not want to believe it. I had always been a Stark. The North was my home. But when I called to Vanmir, he answered. A dragon will not obey unless he recognizes Targaryen blood." Stannis remained silent, his expression unreadable. "I did not seek this power, nor did I crave the throne," Jon continued. "I was raised by a man of honor, your brother's most loyal friend, and as much as I loved him as a father, he was never one to coddle me with sweet lies. If Ned Stark taught me anything, it was that duty comes before desire. It is not about what we want, but what we must do. And now, my duty is to the all of Westeros." Stannis studied him, his fingers tapping against the hilt of his sword. "You speak much like your father did," he said at last. "Ned Stark was a man of principle, a rarity in this realm of schemers and cutthroats." Jon inclined his head. "And he respected you, Lord Stannis. He believed you had the rightful claim after Robert's death. He spoke of you as an honourable man, one who would put the realm before himself. That is why I have come in person, to speak to you with the same respect you are owed. Westeros needs you. I need you. You are one of the finest battlefield commanders this land has ever known." Stannis frowned. "Flattery will not sway me, boy." Jon allowed himself a small smirk. "That was not flattery. It was the truth. And I have not come to beg or deceive. I have come because I believe that you, above all others, understand duty." Stannis was silent for a long moment. Then he turned sharply toward the door. "Melisandre, enter." The great doors swung open, and the Red Woman stepped into the chamber, her ruby necklace glowing faintly. Her eyes, filled with the knowledge of flames,
settled on Jon with an unreadable expression. "Show him," Stannis ordered. Melisandre approached the brazier at the centre of the chamber, flames crackling as she whispered an incantation in High Valyrian. The fire swirled unnaturally, darkening to a deep crimson before shifting to reveal a vision. Jon felt his breath hitch as he saw it. An endless horde of the dead marched across a frozen wasteland, and at their head stood the Night King, his piercing blue eyes burning with unnatural malice. Ice and shadow twisted around him, a storm of death poised to consume the living. The wall, great and mighty, crumbled before him like sand in the wind. The vision faded, the flames returning to normal, but silence hung heavy in the room. Jon exhaled sharply, his hands clenched into fists. "So it's true," he murmured. Stannis nodded. "This is why I fight, why I have held my claim, not because of my own desires, but because the realm needs strength to face this enemy. A divided Westeros will fall before the dead. A united one might stand a chance." Jon met his gaze once more. "Then let us unite it. Together we can prepare for what is to come. But for that to happen, you must concede your claim to the throne." Stannis' expression darkened. "You ask much." "I do, but you have seen what is coming. You know that there is no other path." The Lord of Dragonstone was silent, his gaze locked onto Jon's as if searching his very soul. Then, at last, he exhaled. "Very well. I will not kneel for a boy, nor for a Targaryen," he said gruffly. "I will kneel for the realm. If you are true to your word, and if you are the man you claim to be, then Westeros will need you." And with that, Stannis Baratheon, the last of his name, the rightful heir to Robert Baratheon, bent his knee before Jon Targaryen. Jon stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Rise, Lord Stannis. The war is not yet over, and we must prepare." Stannis stood, his eyes filled with renewed purpose. "Then let us begin." The war for the living had begun. In Meereen, the sun blazed mercilessly, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the Great Pyramid. Within the throne room, Daenerys Targaryen sat upon a gilded seat, her posture regal, yet wary as she observed the Lannisters before her. Cersei, ever poised, stood at the front, her golden hair gleaming under the light. Beside her, Joffrey sneered, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his arrogance radiating from him like a sickness. Tyrion stood slightly apart from them, his expression unreadable. Behind them, a contingent of Lannister soldiers shifted uneasily, surrounded by rows of Unsullied, their spears sharp and unyielding. Daenerys studied them with a calculating gaze before breaking the silence. "You have travelled far, Queen Cersei. Tell me, why should I not have you and your son executed for daring to enter my city?" Cersei lifted her chin defiantly. "Because we bring you knowledge, Your Grace, knowledge of a false king who sits upon your throne." Daenerys arched an eyebrow. "My throne? Last I heard, the Iron Throne belonged to this Jon Targaryen." Cersei's lips curled into a smirk. "Targaryen, is that what he calls himself now?" She stepped forward. "His real name is Jon Snow, a northern bastard raised by the Starks, not a Targaryen by anything other than his pet. He usurped my son's throne and slaughtered my father Tywin Lannister without mercy. He is a murderer, a warlord who cloaks himself in righteousness while ruling by blood and fire." Daenerys' violet eyes darkened. "You claim he murdered your father? For what cause?" Cersei placed a hand over her heart. "For power. Tywin Lannister ruled the Seven Kingdoms in all but name. He kept order, he ensured peace. But Jon Snow, the false king, slew him like a common brigand. He takes what he wants, kills those who stand in his way, and calls it justice. I come to you because you are the rightful queen, not some northern savage who stumbled upon a dragon and crowned himself ruler." Daenerys remained silent for a moment, considering. The thought of another claiming her birthright twisted something cold inside her, but she was not a fool. And what do you want from me? What is it you seek? Cersei smiled, the expression almost serpentine. Justice, the removal of the usurper. Westeros needs a true Targaryen, a queen of fire and blood. But even a queen needs legitimacy. She gestured to Joffrey. I offer you a path to unite your claim with mine. Marry my son, Joffrey Baratheon, and together you will rule the Seven Kingdoms. My family has ruled for decades. The people know us. Combined with your dragons, there would be no force that could oppose us. A silence stretched through the throne room, and then Daenerys laughed. It was not a light-hearted chuckle, but a sharp, mocking laugh. She tilted her head, looking at Joffrey as if he were a piece of rotten meat. You expect me to marry this boy? You offer nothing of value. Joffrey's face turned red with fury. You dare speak to me that way, you foreign whore. I am the rightful king of Westeros. You should be honoured by my proposal. The moment the words left his mouth, the Unsullied moved as one, spears lowering in perfect unison, their tips stopping inches from Joffrey's throat. The Lannister guards reacted instantly, drawing their swords, ready to fight. Joffrey's eyes widened in panic as he stumbled backward. Kill them! Protect your king, he shrieked, his voice cracking with fear. Chaos teetered on the edge of eruption. Stop! Tyrion's voice rang out like a bell through the chamber. The tension remained, but no blood had been spilled, yet. Tyrion turned to Daenerys, bowing his head slightly. Forgive my nephew's lack of decorum. He was not raised to show humility. Daenerys did not take her eyes off Joffrey, who was still breathing heavily, glaring at her with pure hatred. Your nephew is a fool, and fools do not make good kings. That is something I have known for quite some time, Tyrion replied dryly. He took a deep breath before continuing. But we did not come here to squabble. We came because Westeros is in turmoil, because war is brewing, and we all want the same thing. Daenerys narrowed her eyes. And what is that? Tyrion met her gaze, his expression grim. To survive. A hush fell over the throne room. Daenerys sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. I am listening. The Red Keep stood defiant against the wind, its towering walls overlooking the churning waters of Blackwater Bay. Within the halls of power, the small council gathered in the dimly lit chamber, whispering amongst themselves as they awaited their king's arrival. The air was thick with unease. Jon Targaryen had summoned them unexpectedly, and his return from Dragonstone was shrouded in secrecy. The heavy doors groaned open, and Jon strode inside, his black cloak billowing behind him. Ghost padded silently at his side, his crimson eyes scanning the room like a wary sentinel. Behind Jon, another man followed, a figure that cast a long shadow over the assembled lords, Stannis Baratheon. The room stilled as the small council took in the sight before them. The last true Baratheon, thought long defeated, now stood beside their king, his face etched with the same determination that had carried him through countless battles. Grand Maester Pycelle's lips pursed in disapproval, while Mace Tyrell's expression twisted into something between shock and frustration. Edmure Tully, dressed in noble finery, exchanged a wary glance with the Great Jon, who simply smirked, intrigued by the sudden turn of events. Jon stepped forward, his voice firm. Lord Stannis Baratheon will be joining the small council. Mace Tyrell scoffed. Your Grace, surely you jest. This man raised arms against the Iron Throne not once, but twice. He burned the 7 temples and waged war upon my house. Stannis did not react to the insult, but his jaw clenched. Jon, however, remained steadfast. And yet he is here, not as an enemy, but as an ally. There was no blood spilled in our meeting, no swords drawn.
Stannis has agreed to put aside his claim and to serve the realm, for he understands what is coming. Pycelle's aged fingers trembled as he leaned forward. And what, your grace, do you mean by what is coming? Jon's eyes darkened. A war like no other, not one of men, but of the dead. A silence hung heavy over the chamber before Lord Manderley, ever the pragmatic one, spoke. Forgive me, your grace, but are we expected to believe in old wives' tales, ghost stories of dead men marching beyond the wall? Jon remained calm, though his patience was waning. I do not expect you to believe me on words alone, but I have seen it with my own eyes, and so has Stannis. Stannis stepped forward, his gravelly voice filling the chamber. At Dragonstone, the Red Woman showed me a vision, one Jon has seen as well. The dead rise, an army of ice and shadow, moving south to claim all of Westeros. The wall will not hold them forever. Mace Tyrell's scoff was audible. And you expect us to arm the entire realm based on visions? The cost alone. Jon cut him off. Melisandre. The doors opened once more, and the Red Priestess entered. The ruby at her throat glowed faintly as she approached the brazier at the centre of the chamber. She whispered an incantation, and the flames twisted, darkening into a deep crimson, before revealing the same vision Jon and Stannis had witnessed. The council members gasped, some recoiling, others leaning forward in stunned horror as they watched the image of the Night King and his endless army marching upon Westeros. The flames returned to normal, leaving behind a silence thick with realization. Lord Manderley swallowed hard. 7 save us. Jon's voice was unwavering. We will not wait for them to come to us. We must prepare. Stannis will lead the defence of Westeros, coordinating strategy across the realm. Each of you will see to the preparations in your respective kingdoms. Send word to the others. This war concerns all. Pycelle hesitated, but finally nodded. Very well, your grace. We shall begin at once. Mace Tyrell, though still wary, sighed in resignation. And what of you, your grace? Jon's gaze was resolute. I will go to the wall myself. I must see the Night's Watch, and I will take Valnir with me. In the heart of Meereen, the sun cast a golden hue over the city, its rays illuminating the Great Pyramid like a beacon of power. Within its throne room, the air was thick with tension, a silent battlefield where words could wield as much destruction as swords. At the far end of the chamber, Daenerys Targaryen sat upon her seat of power, the polished stone beneath her a stark contrast to the fire that burned in her veins. Her violet eyes, sharp and unyielding, fixed upon the small figure before her, Tyrion Lannister. Beside Tyrion stood his kin, their presence a stain upon the grandeur of the throne room. Cersei Lannister's expression was a mask of controlled disdain, her golden hair cascading over the crimson folds of her gown, and beside her, Joffrey Baratheon stood with his usual air of arrogant entitlement, his sneer ever present, his fingers twitching as though longing to wrap around the hilt of a sword. Flanking them, Lannister guards in crimson and gold remained rigid, their hands resting warily on the pommels of their weapons, though they were vastly outnumbered. Around the chamber, the disciplined ranks of the Unsullied stood motionless, their spears poised, their unreadable expressions a silent warning that any false move would be met with swift retribution. Tyrion, ever the diplomat, took a measured breath and stepped forward. Your Grace, he began smoothly, we find ourselves in a precarious position. War looms over us like a storm cloud, but perhaps there is a way to negotiate terms without the need for bloodshed. Daenerys regarded him coolly. And what exactly do you propose? Tyrion allowed a small, knowing smile to play at his lips. A bargaining tool. Daenerys arched an eyebrow. And what might that be? Cersei was the one to answer, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Sansa Stark. A flicker of something crossed Daenerys' face. Curiosity, concern, and perhaps even fury. The name of Stark carried weight, a name tied to the north, To betrayal, to loyalty, and to suffering. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. You have her. Tyrion inclined his head slightly, but it was Cersei who stepped forward, her posture exuding triumph. She has been in our custody for some time now, a valuable piece in this game. The words sent a ripple of tension through the room. Daenerys' expression darkened like an oncoming storm. Her gaze flicked to Joffrey, who was smirking with a twisted sense of amusement, as if holding a Stark was nothing more than an amusing jest to him. Daenerys' voice was steady, but cold. Bring her here, now. A soldier bowed and exited the chamber. Moments stretched unbearably as silence hung over the gathering. When the heavy doors swung open once more, all eyes turned to the figure stepping into the throne room. Sansa Stark. She was thinner than Daenerys expected from the stories, her once flawless porcelain skin marred by exhaustion, her auburn hair slightly unkempt. Yet despite the hardships, she had clearly endured, her eyes holding a flicker of defiance, of strength unbroken. She took measured steps, glancing between Daenerys, Cersei and Tyrion, her mind no doubt racing to decipher what game was being played around her. Cersei's satisfaction was palpable as she gestured to the young Stark. A gift, if you will, proof of goodwill. Daenerys rose from her seat, stepping forward with regal grace. When she spoke, her voice was softer, yet no less commanding. Sansa. Sansa straightened, her expression wary but controlled. Your Grace. For a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between the two women. Different paths had led them here, but they were both survivors of a world that had tried to break them. Daenerys exhaled, then turned to her guards. Take her to my private quarters. She will wash, rest, and be given proper food. Cersei's eyes flashed with anger. She is our prisoner. Daenerys turned sharply, her expression hard as steel. Not anymore. Joffrey scoffed. This is ridiculous. We should put her in chains. She is a Stark. Daenerys stepped closer, her gaze burning into the boy king with open disdain. A ruler who uses prisoners as bargaining chips is no ruler at all. I will not align myself with those who would treat a woman as a mere pawn. Cersei's jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists. We came here offering terms. Daenerys lifted her chin, her next words final. I have entertained this farce long enough. She turned her gaze to Grey Worm, who stood at attention. Take the Lannisters to the dungeons. All of them. The Unsullied moved as one, closing in swiftly. The Lannister guards reached for their swords, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Spears were at their throats before their blades could be drawn. Joffrey let out a strangled protest as a firm hand gripped his arm. You dare, he spat. I am your king. Daenerys met his gaze with unwavering calm. You are a boy playing at power, and I do not answer to you. Tyrion, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, let out a slow sigh. Well, he muttered under his breath, that could have gone worse. As the Unsullied leapt the captured Lannisters away, Daenerys turned her attention back to Sansa. The young Stark watched the scene unfold with wide eyes, but there was something else beneath her gaze, a hint of relief. Daenerys regarded her for a moment, then spoke, her voice softer now. Rest, Lady Stark. You are safe here. Sansa hesitated before inclining her head in gratitude. As she was escorted away, Daenerys returned to her throne, her mind already turning toward the next move. The war for Westeros had truly begun. The air grew colder as Valnir soared over the snow-laden forests of the north, his massive wings casting a shadow over the land below. Jon Targaryen tightened his grip on the saddle, his long black hair whipping in the wind. Ghost ran far below, pale blur against the frostbitten ground. The wall loomed in the distance, an icy monolith stretching endlessly across the horizon. The sight filled Jon with a mixture of nostalgia and dread. For years he had heard tales of Castle Black and the men of the Night's Watch, and in another life he would have been one of their most famous brothers. But now he approached as king of the Seven Kingdoms. Valnir descended, landing just beyond the gates of Castle Black, its enormous frame sending snow and ice cascading through the courtyard. The black-cloaked men of the Night's Watch stood rigid, their eyes wide as they took in the dragon before them. Jon dismounted, his boots crunching the snow as he strode forward, his breath visible in the frigid air. The gates creaked open, and from within stepped Lord Commander Alistair Thorne, his face as stern and unyielding as the wall itself. But there was something different in his gaze. Respect. Once, Thorne had despised Jon for his bastard name and his ties to the north, but now Jon was a king, a true Targaryen, and that changed everything. "Your Grace," Thorne said, bowing his head slightly. "Castle Black welcomes you." Jon nodded. "Lord Commander, I have come not as a king to claim authority, but as a man who understands the war that lies beyond the wall. I need a full report on the state of the Night's Watch and every castle along the wall." Thorne gestured towards the warmth of the hall. "Then let us speak, Your Grace." Inside, the great hall was dimly lit, the fire casting long shadows on the stone walls. Thorne remained rigid as he spoke, detailing the dwindling numbers of the Watch, the castles left abandoned, and the growing presence of wildlings seeking refuge from the terror beyond. "We have less than 1,000 men left," Thorne admitted. "East Watch still holds, but Shadow Tower is undermanned. Most castles are nothing more than empty husks. If the dead march, we will not hold." Jon absorbed the grim news, his mind already racing with plans. "Then we will reinforce the wall. I will send men and supplies. We hold here, or we lose the world." At that moment, the door creaked open, and a steward entered. Samwell Tarly. He was bundled in furs, his round face flushed from the cold. His eyes widened as he met Jon's gaze, and a smile broke across his face. "Jon," Sam stammered. "I mean, Your Grace." Jon chuckled. "It's nice to meet you." Sam quickly laid out reports on the abandoned castles, explaining their state with his usual scholarly detail. Jon listened intently, nodding in approval. The two men spoke for hours, forming an unlikely camaraderie. Jon knew he had found an ally in Sam, a man whose knowledge would be invaluable in the coming war. Across the sea and marine, the Great Pyramid stood bathed in golden sunlight, its towering structure casting long shadows over the city below. From her throne in the vast audience chamber, Daenerys Targaryen surveyed the room before her violet eyes sharp with contemplation. The air was thick with the scent of exotic incense, mingling with the faint traces of the sea breeze that drifted in through the open balcony. Before her stood her most trusted advisors, Sir Jorah Mormont, Sir Barristan Selmy, and Grey Worm. Their expressions were grave. Jorah was the first to speak, his voice measured but urgent. "Jon Targaryen has the strength of 3 kingdoms behind him, the North, the Riverlands, and the Vale. Even those who do not swear direct allegiance to him respect him. If war comes, we may find ourselves outmatched." Barristan Selmy stroked his white beard thoughtfully, his gaze distant. "Perhaps war is not the answer," he said after a pause. "Jon has proven himself honourable, both on the battlefield and in leadership. We should consider an alliance rather than bloodshed." Daenerys' fingers drummed lightly against the armrest of her throne. "Do you believe we would lose?" she asked, her voice even but laced with curiosity. The two knights exchanged glances. It was Jorah who spoke first, his tone reluctant but honest. "With our current strength? Yes. His armies are battle-tested, ours are not." Barristan nodded in agreement. "And then there is Valnir. Jon's dragon is larger than any of ours, and has seen true combat. If it came to a battle of dragons, at best, it would be an even match. At worst, his experience would triumph. Daenerys leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. Then why should I not strike first? Jorah took a step closer, his expression pleading yet resolute. Because, Daenerys, there is no reason for the two of you to be enemies. The world does not need another war. It needs unity. A tense silence settled over the chamber. Daenerys studied Jorah carefully, searching his face for any sign of doubt or deceit. When she found none, she turned her attention to Barristan. And do you trust him? As a man who has served my family, as a knight who has lived through the treacheries of kings and lords, tell me, can I trust Jon Snow? Barristan exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. I respected his father, Eddard Stark. From all I have heard, Jon has inherited the best traits of him. He is an honourable man, perhaps to a fault. If he speaks of the threat beyond the wall, then it is real. He does not seek power for the sake of power. He fights because he must. Daenerys' gaze softened, though only slightly. She turned to Missandei, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, observing with quiet attentiveness. Send word to King's Landing, Daenerys commanded. I wish to meet Jon Targaryen. We will discuss the future of Westeros, together. Missandei bowed her head. As you command, Your Grace. The wall stood as it always had, cold, vast, and imposing. The wind howled through the frozen battlements, carrying with it the promise of ice and death. Jon Targaryen stood atop the wall, his fur-lined cloak billowing behind him as he gazed into the abyss beyond. The north stretched out before him, an endless expanse of white and shadow, where dangers lurked unseen. Somewhere out there, the dead were waiting. He gripped the hilt of his sword, lost in thought. The war for Westeros was brewing, but it was not the war he feared most. The true enemy was still in the darkness, gathering strength, biding its time. He had seen them with his own eyes, the White Walkers, their piercing blue gaze, their relentless march. A gust of wind sent a shiver through him, but he did not flinch. He had the north behind him, the Night's Watch beside him, and a dragon beneath him. And soon, he would meet the Dragon Queen. He had heard the whispers, Daenerys Stormborn, breaker of chains and mother of dragons. A queen forged in fire, hardened by loss. Was she a tyrant in the making, or a ruler who could unite the Seven Kingdoms? Jon did not yet know, but he would find out. The fate of Westeros would not be decided by swords alone. It would be decided by the choices they made next. The cold wind howled atop the wall, carrying with it the icy whispers of the north. Jon Targaryen stood on the battlements, his fur-lined cloak billowing behind him as he gazed out beyond the endless stretch of white. The dead were out there, waiting, and yet a different battle loomed on the horizon. A raven arrived at dawn. The black-feathered messenger bore a scroll sealed with the sigil of the hand of the king. Jon took it from the steward, unrolling it carefully as the words revealed themselves. Your Grace, the small council has received word from Essos. Queen Daenerys Targaryen wishes to meet with you. She has expressed a desire to discuss the future of Westeros and the stability of the realm. She awaits your response. Jon read the letter twice before lowering it, his expression unreadable. He had known that Daenerys was gathering strength across the narrow sea, but he had not expected her to reach out for a meeting. He turned to the assembled officers of the Night's Watch. I must leave for the south. Alliser Thorne, standing rigidly beside him, gave a curt nod. The wall will hold, Your Grace. but the dead do not wait for kings. Jon's gaze was unwavering. I will send regular supplies from the south. You will have the men and provisions you need. He turned to Lord Commander Thorne, clasping his forearm. You have my word. Thorne hesitated before nodding. Then go, and return with an army if you can. Jon gave one last glance at the frozen north before descending the wall, Ghost padding silently beside him. His mind was already set. He would meet Daenerys Targaryen at Dragonstone. The waves crashed violently against the dark cliffs of Dragonstone as Jon stood upon the shore, his advisors flanking him. The sky was overcast, the sea a churning mass of grey. The ancient fortress loomed above them, its blackened stone a testament to Targaryen rule of old. Then, on the horizon, they appeared. Several ships sliced through the waves, their sails emblazoned with the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Above them, 3 mighty dragons circled the sky, Daenerys' children, their massive forms casting shadows over the water. Beside Jon, Vale let out a deep, rumbling growl. The great dragon was crouched behind him, his golden eyes locked onto the approaching trio. Ghost, ever watchful, stood at Jon's side, his white fur bristling with anticipation. The ships docked, and 100 unsullied soldiers disembarked in perfect formation. And then she emerged. Daenerys Targaryen stepped onto the shore with an air of quiet authority. Her silver hair was braided intricately, and she wore a flowing gown of black and crimson. Ser Jorah Mormont and Missandei walked beside her, while Grey Worm led the disciplined Unsullied behind them. As soon as Daenerys' feet touched the rocky shore, the dragons above let out piercing cries. Drogon, her largest, hovered protectively above her, while Rhaegal and Viserion circled menacingly. Valnir growled in response, his wings flaring slightly. But Jon stepped forward, raising a gloved hand. Enough, he commanded firmly. Valnir let out a final snort before settling. Daenerys studied him for a long moment before speaking. You command your dragon well. Jon nodded. And you yours. He gestured towards the castle. Shall we? Together they walked towards Dragonstone, their entourages following closely behind. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Jon spoke. I am pleased to meet you, but I must ask, what is it that you want? Daenerys' violet eyes were unreadable. My whole life I have dreamed of returning to Westeros. Since my brother's death, I have believed that the throne was mine by right. Jon tensed at her words. So you want the Iron Throne? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but I do not seek it for personal glory. I want to rule so that I can change the world for the better. I want to bring justice to those who have wronged my family, and to the people of Westeros. Jon studied her intently. He could see the fire in her gaze, the unwavering belief in her purpose. He respected that. But his path had been forged in battle and in sacrifice. He had never sought power, yet the North had crowned him. I am king by right, Jon said. I never wanted it, but the people placed their trust in me. I have a duty to ensure peace, to keep the realm from falling into chaos. And more than that, his expression darkened. There is a greater threat than any crown or throne. Beyond the wall, the dead are coming. Daenerys' brow furrowed. The White Walkers. Jon nodded. You've heard of them? Daenerys' gaze did not waver. Yes, my people have brought me reports. Stories of frozen horrors beyond the wall. Whispered warnings from traders and sailors who have passed through Westeros. I did not want to believe them at first, but the more I heard, the more I realized there is truth to these claims. Jon exhaled, feeling a rare sense of relief. Then you understand. We must reunite the realm under a strong leader. I cannot give up my crown. Daenerys was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke. I do not wish for unnecessary bloodshed. We are the last Targaryens. Instead of being enemies, we should rule together. Jon's eyes widened slightly. You mean marriage? Daenerys laughed softly, tilting her head. A marriage would solidify our claims. Together, no one could rival us. The Seven Kingdoms would be whole once more. Jon opened his mouth to respond, but she raised a hand. I do not expect an answer now, but as a gesture of good faith, I offer you a gift. She signalled to one of her soldiers. From the largest ship, a figure was led down onto the dock. Jon's breath caught in his throat. Sansa. The moment their eyes met, Sansa Stark broke into a run. Jon rushed forward, meeting her halfway as she threw her arms around him. He held her tightly, his heart hammering in his chest. You're safe, he murmured. Gods, you're safe. Sansa pulled back, tears in her eyes. Daenerys found me. She freed me from those who wished to use me. Jon turned to Daenerys. How did you find her? Daenerys smiled faintly. She is not the only gift I offer. Jon exhaled slowly, glancing from Sansa to Daenerys. The pieces were shifting, the world was changing, and soon he would have to make a choice. The fate of Westeros rested on the path they chose next. The waves crashed against the shores of Dragonstone as Jon and Daenerys stood atop the castle's battlements, looking out over the dark waters. The fires of their dragons still smouldered in the distant sky, their presence a silent testament to the power the Targaryens now commanded. The realm was shifting, and soon the fate of Westeros would be sealed. Jon turned to Daenerys. You said you have the Lannisters prisoner. All of them. Daenerys nodded. Joffrey and Cersei were captured when we took King's Landing. Tyrion surrendered willingly, and the younger children were taken into custody without a fight. They are being held under guard by my most trusted soldiers. Jon exhaled, his breath misting in the cool evening air. That is a relief. I currently hold Jaime. He surrendered after battle rather than seeing more men die needlessly. Daenerys tilted her head slightly. And what do you intend to do with him? Jon studied her carefully before answering. I was about to ask you the same question. Cersei and Joffrey have caused my family endless suffering. My father, my brother, and countless of my people fell because of them. As long as they live, there will never be peace. And the North demands justice. Daenerys' violet eyes burned with understanding. Then the choice is yours, Your Grace. You are King of Westeros. If justice is what the North seeks, then let justice be served. Jon hesitated for only a moment before nodding. They must be executed. Daenerys inclined her head solemnly. And Jaime? Jon sighed, running a gloved hand through his thick curls. He killed your father. His fate should be in your hands. She regarded him thoughtfully before answering. I do not wish for vengeance, not for its own sake. But Jaime Lannister is a dangerous man, and if left alive, he could pose a threat to our rule. I agree. He should be executed. A long silence stretched between them, the weight of their decision settling like an iron crown upon their shoulders. Finally, Daenerys spoke again. What about Tyrion and the younger children? Jon's gaze softened slightly. Tyrion has proven himself more reasonable than his siblings. And the children, they are innocent. They should not pay for the crimes of their family. Daenerys nodded. Then they shall live. They should be wards of the crown, raised under our watch to ensure that the next generation of Lannisters are loyal to the realm. With the decision made, the executions were carried out swiftly. Cersei and Joffrey were beheaded before a silent crowd in the Dragon Pit, their reign of tyranny brought to an undeniable end. Jaime, once the Kingslayer, met his fate with quiet dignity, his final words lost to the wind. The realm watched, and with each fallen Lannister, a chapter of blood and war was closed. Months passed, and under Jon and Daenerys' rule, Westeros flourished. The North and the South were united as never before, their shared leadership a beacon of strength and stability. Trade routes thrived, cities were rebuilt, and for the first time in living memory, the people dared to hope. It was during this time of newfound peace that Jon and Daenerys married. The great halls of the Red Keep had never seen a celebration so grand, nor had the Seven Kingdoms witnessed a union so full of promise. Lords and ladies from across Westeros gathered to bear witness as the dragon and the wolf became one. Dragons soared above the ceremony, their mighty roars echoing through the capital. Feasts were held for days, wine flowing like rivers, as the people of King's Landing revelled in the dawn of a new age. As the celebration waned and the kingdom settled into prosperity, Jon and Daenerys found themselves in the halls of the Red Keep, enjoying a quiet dinner together. The golden glow of candlelight flickered above them, the warmth of their bond evident in the comfortable silence they shared. Then a knock came at the door. The Chamberlain entered hastily, his expression grim. "Your Grace, I bring urgent news." Jon set down his goblet, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" "Reports from the Iron Islands, Your Grace," the Chamberlain said, his voice laced with unease. "Euron Greyjoy has taken control. He has been crowned King of the Iron Islands." Daenerys' expression darkened. Euron Greyjoy. We should have dealt with him when we had the chance. Jon exchanged a look with her, his jaw tightening. If he is king now, it means he has plans, and if there's one thing we know about Euron, is that he won't be content with just one throne. Daenerys set her goblin down with a quiet thud. "Then we must prepare for war." Jon nodded, rising from his chair. Outside, the dragons roared into the night, their cries echoing across the city like a warning of the storm to come. Far across the sea, the shores of the Iron Islands were painted with blood. The great hall of Pike was filled with the scent of salt and slaughter. The bodies of those who dared oppose Euron Greyjoy were strewn across the stone floor. The king's moot had not gone as tradition dictated. Those who questioned him had been silenced permanently. Euron stood before his newly anointed subjects, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his cruel grin. His arms were streaked with crimson, his axe resting heavily in his grip. He looked upon the gathered Ironborn, those who had lived, those who had accepted their new king, and he laughed. "Brothers and sisters of the Iron Islands," he called, his voice booming through the hall. "You stand in the presence of a king who has seen the world. I have sailed further than any man in history. I have seen wonders beyond your feeble imaginations. I have sacked cities, bedded queens, and carved my name into the bones of empires. And now, my sights return to Westeros." A few of the gathered Ironborn laughed bitterly. One stepped forward, wiping the blood from his brow. "Aye, and have you not heard, Your Grace? Westeros belongs to the dragons. Targaryens rule once more, and they have 4 grown dragons at their command. Tell me, how do you plan to fight fire itself Euron's grin widened, his teeth gleaming in the dim torchlight. "Oh, my dear friend," he purred, stepping closer. "Who said we would fight alone?" With a dramatic flourish, he reached into his cloak and pulled forth an ancient, twisted horn, its surface covered in dark runes that seemed to writhe in the firelight. The Ironborn murmured amongst themselves, unease creeping into their eyes. "The Horn of Winter," Euron declared, "forged in the oldest fires of the world. With it, I shall call upon powers far greater than dragons. Westeros will fall before me, and we shall drown the realm in blood and storm." The hall erupted in roars of approval, the Ironborn chanting his name. Outside, the waves crashed violently against the cliffs of Pike, as if the sea itself whispered of the doom yet to come. The flames of the great hearth cast flickering shadows across the chamber as Jon and Daenerys stood before their gathered council. The air was thick with tension, the weight of impending war pressing down upon them like an iron shroud. The news from the Iron Islands had arrived only hours ago, carried by a weary raven that brought dire tidings. Euron Greyjoy had seized control of the Ironborn and was rallying them for conquest. Jon's expression was hard as he turned to the council. "Euron is a madman, but he is not without cunning. He would not have declared war unless he believed he could win." Daenerys nodded, her violet eyes burning with determination. "We cannot allow him to gain a foothold in Westeros. If we do, the bloodshed will never end." Edmure Tully, standing near the map table, exhaled sharply. "Euron's fleet is vast and dangerous, but we have something he does not. Dragons. We must use them." Jon turned to the Chamberlain. "Send word to Stannis at the wall. He is to continue fortifying the defences and oversee preparations while we deal with the Greyjoys." He turned to the Master of Ravens. "Send a raven to House Mallister at Seaguard. Their fleet is to launch toward the Iron Islands and wait for our arrival. The Lannisters have been growing their navy considerably for the last year. They will be ready." With their orders dispatched and preparations made, Jon and Daenerys headed towards the dragon pit. The air was cool, but it carried the scent of fire and salt. As they approached, Valnir and Drogon lifted their heads, their massive eyes glinting in the torchlight. The beasts knew what was coming. War. Jon mounted Valnir, feeling the immense power beneath him as his dragon stirred, his wings stretching in anticipation. Daenerys climbed atop Drogon, her silver hair whipping in the wind as the beast roared into the night. With a final glance at each other, they took to the skies, soaring westward toward the Iron Islands, with Viserion and Rhaegal following close behind. For hours they flew, the world below shrinking into a dark blur of land and sea. As they neared their destination, a storm brewed on the horizon, the sky darkening with thick clouds, the scent of rain mixed with the distant, acrid smoke of battle. As they broke through the storm front, the Iron Islands came into view. The sea was ablaze. The Iron Fleet had already launched and was locked in a brutal battle with the reinforced Mallister navy. Warships clashed against each other, steel ringing, as men fought desperately on burning decks. Arrows soared through the sky, and the waters churned with sinking wreckage and bodies. Jon and Daenerys wasted no time. With a single command, the dragons descended upon the battlefield, unleashing torrents of fire. Drogon swept low, his black scales blending with the smoke as he rained destruction upon the Ironborn ships. Valnir followed, engulfing entire vessels in flames as their crews screamed in terror. The tide of battle shifted instantly. Where the Ironborn had been pressing the attack, they now faltered, their ranks thrown into chaos by the dragon's wrath. The Lannisters fleet surged forward, seizing the advantage, their ships launching devastating volleys into the enemy's hulls. Uron, watching from the ramparts of Pike, clenched his jaw in frustration. His fleet was being obliterated before his eyes, but he did not waver. Instead, he turned and strode back into his great hall, where his true power lay waiting. Jon and Daenerys circled above the castle, their dragons unleashing waves of fire upon the towers and walls. The once imposing fortress of Pike burned, the ancient stone cracking under the heat. Satisfied that the stronghold was sufficiently weakened, they dismounted and entered the ruins. Inside the great hall, Euron sat upon the salt throne, an eerie smile playing across his lips. The chamber was dimly lit, the firelight casting long, wicked shadows over his cruel features. In his hands, he held an ancient, twisted horn, covered in dark, writhing runes, the Horn of Winter. Jon stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Your war is over, Euron." Euron chuckled, his voice dripping with madness. "Oh, dear boy, you think this was a war? No, this was merely a distraction." Daenerys narrowed her eyes. "You have lost. Your fleet burns, your castle crumbles. There is nothing left for you." Euron's grin widened. "You fools. I am not here to win. I am here to bring about the end." Before Jon could react, Euron lifted the horn to his lips and blew. The sound that followed was deafening. A monstrous, otherworldly wail filled the chamber, shaking the very foundations of Pike. The air grew thick, the walls trembled violently. Jon staggered, his vision blurring as the unnatural resonance filled his mind with dread. Daenerys clutched her head, her knees buckling under the weight of the sound. Jon gritted his teeth and fought through the pain, forcing himself to move. With a final, desperate lunge, he drove his sword through Euron's chest. The Mad King let out a breathless laugh, blood spilling from his lips. "Too late," he whispered as he slumped forward, lifeless. Jon turned to Daenerys, breathing heavily. What did he do? Before she could answer, the ground beneath them trembled violently. Far to the north, the wall stood as it had for thousands of years, an unyielding monolith against the terrors beyond. Stannis Baratheon strode along its battlements, overseeing the training of the new recruits. Thousands of men had joined the Night's Watch, preparing for a war that was yet to come. Then, without warning, the wall shuddered. A deep, resonant crack echoed through the frozen air, followed by a deafening roar, as massive cracks split the ancient ice. With a thunderous crash, a vast section of the wall collapsed, sending ice and stone plummeting into the abyss below. Stannis shielded his eyes from the blinding snow and ice, but when he turned back, he saw a gaping hole where once Castle Black had stood. Stannis immediately set about ordering the survivors to help rescue those trapped in the rubble. Castle Black had served as their primary defence, but it was not alone. Miles and miles of trenches and archers' towers had been built to serve as several lines of defence in anticipation of the wall being breached. Stannis ordered his men to fall back to the first line and to send casualties south to Winterfell and notify them of what has happened. He ordered Sam Tarly to lead the first caravan of casualties. As the Night's Watch began to reorganise, a sudden horn blast rang out and a single voice cried out, "There's something on the horizon." Stannis turned, his breath catching in his throat as he saw them. Dark figures, moving in the endless white. Hundreds, thousands. A tide of death surging toward the breach. The others had come. The embers of war still smouldered over the Iron Islands as Jon and Daenerys landed their dragons amidst the wreckage of the battlefield. The scent of salt and burning wood filled the air, mingling with the cries of the wounded and the dying. The Lannister fleet, battered but victorious, held the surviving Ironborn at sword point as their remaining ships floated in ruin. Jon dismounted Valnir, his boots crunching against the scorched stone as he approached Lord Jason Mallister, who stood amidst his men, his armour splattered with the blood of battle. "My lord," Jon called, his voice carrying over the howling wind. "Take the surrendering Ironborn as prisoners. House Mallister will have its revenge against their raiders, but we need them alive. The true war lies in the north." Lord Mallister wiped the blood from his brow and gave a firm nod. "Aye, your grace. We'll see to it. And what of you?" Daenerys, still mounted on Drogon, her silver hair flowing in the sea breeze, spoke with authority. "We head north immediately. We do not know the nature of Euron's weapon, but we must ensure the preparations to the north are unaffected. We must regroup with Stannis and the Night's Watch." Mallister's face darkened, but he gave a sharp nod. "Then may the gods be with you both." Without another word, Jon climbed back atop Valnir, gripping the dragon's ridges as the beast had lifted into the sky. Daenerys followed, and together they soared northward. As they approached the wall, the devastation became evident. A gaping wound had been torn through the ancient ice, a sheer break in the monolithic barrier that had stood for thousands of years. Smoke and fire flickered across the shattered remnants of the wall's defences. Below, the battle raged. Jon and Daenerys could see Stannis Baratheon and his forces holding the line, their banners whipping violently in the frozen wind. The Night's Watch, once a scattered and struggling force, had become a well-trained army after years of preparation. Thousands of black-cloaked soldiers stood in disciplined formations, their dragon-glass spears gleaming under the pale light of the moon. Trenches lined the battlefield, filled with burning oil that set the dead ablaze as they poured through the breach. Spiked barricades slowed the relentless tide, and archers loosed flaming arrows, striking down wights by the dozen. The air was thick with screams and the unearthly howls of the White Walker's army. Jon glanced at Daenerys and gave a curt nod. "We strike now." With a single command, the dragons descended. Drogon, Viserion, Rhaegal, and Valnir rained down torrents of dragonfire, sweeping across the battlefield and incinerating the dead. The infernal blaze spread like wildfire, turning thousands of wights into charred husks. Their screeches of agony filled the night as the creatures burned, their brittle forms crumbling into ash. The respite gave Stannis and his men time to fall back, regroup, and evacuate the wounded. Jon guided Valnir to land near Stannis, jumping down and striding toward the hardened king. "How bad is it?" Jon asked, gripping his sword tightly. Stannis wiped soot from his face. "Bad, not hopeless. The wall still stands for the most part. The collapse has created a natural choke point. They can only come through one way now, and we are cutting them down as they approach." He turned to face Jon fully. "We can win, but only if we bring reinforcements." Jon nodded. "I'll go to Winterfell. Hold the line." Stannis clasped Jon's shoulder. "Go quickly, Jon. I will not fall while I still draw breath." Jon leapt back onto Valnir and took to the skies, flying faster than ever toward Winterfell. The banners of the north fluttered proudly over Winterfell's battlements. Tens of thousands of soldiers were garrisoned there within the castle walls. Knights, bannermen, and warriors from every corner of the realm, who had pledged their swords to the last great war. Jon landed Valnir in the courtyard, his arrival drawing the attention of the gathered lords and soldiers. He strode forward, his voice ringing with urgency. "To arms! The wall has fallen and the dead are pouring through the breach. We ride north now." A thunderous cheer erupted from the crowd as warriors rushed to their steeds, donning armour and readying their weapons. The north was ready to fight. As Jon turned to leave, a familiar voice called out, "Jon, wait." Jon spun to see Samwell Tarly hurrying toward him. His face was pale with urgency. Sam had arrived days before on a routine supply run from the wall. "Sam, I have to go," Jon said quickly. "I know, but this is important," Sam said, breathless. He pulled something from beneath his cloak. A sword, gleaming in the dim light. Jon's breath caught as he recognized the dark steel and elegant craftsmanship. Valyrian steel. Sam held it out. "This is Dark Sister." Jon stared in disbelief. "That sword was lost." "Maester Aemon had it all these years," Sam explained. "Before he died, he told me to give it to you if I ever had the chance. He believed that as the last Targaryen, you were worthy of it." Jon took the blade, its weight feeling natural in his grip. The steel gleamed with an ancient, lethal beauty. He drew it from its scabbard, marvelling at the razor-thin edge and the history it carried. He looked at Sam, his voice quieter now. "Thank you, Sam." Sam gave a small smile. "I think you'll need it." Jon nodded, sheathing the blade before leaping back onto Valnir. With a final glance at his friend, he urged the dragon into the sky, racing north toward the true war. As Jon approached the wall, he saw the battle still raging. The Night's Watch held firm, their formations unbroken, their resolve steeled by years of preparation. The dead continued their relentless assault, but they were no longer advancing unchallenged. The dragons soared overhead, unleashing torrents of fire. The soldiers of the north would soon arrive. Jon tightened his grip on Dark Sister, feeling its ancient power in his hands. He knew this was the beginning of the final battle, the moment that would decide the fate of the world. The long night was here, and he would meet it with fire and steel. The storm howled like a wounded beast, shrieking through the ruined battlefield before the wall. Wind-swept snow and ice lashed against the defenders, their dark cloaks whipping violently as they fought to hold their fragile ground. The breach in the wall gaped wide like a mortal wound, an unnatural darkness spilling through as an endless horde of dead clawed and scrambled over one another, pouring forward with mindless determination. For every wight that fell to steel or flame, 10 more took its place. Jon Targaryen and Daenerys soared above the carnage, their dragons slicing through the blizzard with powerful beats of their wings. Below them, the battle was chaos, a clash of fire and ice, life and death. The Night's Watch and Stannis Baratheon's soldiers fought desperately, their black and crimson banners barely visible in the frenzied melee. Trench fires flickered and sputtered in the relentless storm, casting long shadows as whites charged forward, only to be met with dragonglass, arrow, and flame. Jon guided Valnir into a sharp dive, the dragon's eyes fixed on the thickest cluster of the undead. With a command, the great beast opened its maw, and unleashed a torrential blast of dragonfire. The inferno spread in waves, engulfing dozens of wights in an instant. They screeched as their frozen flesh blackened and cracked, their forms collapsing into heaps of smouldering bones. Drogon, black as night, followed in kind. Daenerys rode low over the battlefield, silver hair whipping in the wind. Her expression was carved from stone, calm, regal, hardened by war. She guided Drogon in a sweeping arc, setting entire ranks of wights ablaze. But for every burning husk, more of the dead climbed forward, their frozen fingers grasping, their soulless eyes unblinking. Jon urged Valnir back into the sky, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He cast a glance at Daenerys as she circled beside him, their dragons moving in eerie synchrony. "We can't hold them forever," she called over the storm, her voice barely carrying above the wind and the roars of their dragons. "Even dragonfire has its limits." Jon clenched his jaw. She was right. The tide of the dead was unrelenting, and the dragons cannot burn forever. The breach was the key. If they could not stop the flow, the living would be overwhelmed before the reinforcements arrived. "We need to block the breach," he shouted back. "If we can slow them, we might hold until the army arrives." Daenerys' eyes flickered with understanding. She scanned the towering ice around the breach, then nodded. "We use the wall itself. Drogon and Valnir can tear it down, collapse it into the opening." Jon did not hesitate. He wheeled Valnir round, rising high above the wall's shattered remains. Daenerys followed, the two dragons carving upward through the snow-laden sky. Then, together, they dove, unleashing their flames upon the towering edges of the breach. The ancient ice, hardened over thousands of years, resisted at first, but the dragon's fire was no ordinary flame. The wall groaned and splintered, massive cracks racing like veins of fire through the frozen expanse. Huge slabs of ice trembled and then broke loose, crashing down in an avalanche of frozen ruin. The dead beneath were buried instantly, their inhuman screeches lost beneath the deafening collapse. Jon pulled Valnir into a steep climb before commanding him into another dive. This time, the dragon's massive claws tore into the remaining ledges of ice, ripping great chunks free and sending them plummeting into the breach. Drogon joined him, using his massive frame to knock entire sections loose. The storm winds howled in protest as the dragons worked, tearing and burning, until at last, with one final cataclysmic crash, the breach was choked with a jagged barricade of frozen debris. The tide of the dead slowed. Wights at the forefront clawed futilely at the ice, scrambling to climb, but the sheer unstable walls of the blockage held. The army of the dead, for the first time, was halted. Jon and Daenerys landed atop the frozen barricade, steam rising from the dragons' nostrils as their chests heaved with exertion. Snow and ash swirled around them as they surveyed their work. It was not a permanent fix, but it had bought them time. Stannis Baratheon approached, his heavy cloak snapping in the wind. His expression was as grim as ever, but his eyes held something resembling approval as he studied the makeshift barricade. "It will hold. For now," he said, his voice carrying no comfort. Jon dismounted, his boots crunching against the ice. "The Night's Watch can defend what remains of the breach. If any dead get through, we cut them down." Stannis exhaled, his breath a cloud in the frigid air. "I prepared for this war as best I could," he admitted, "but I never imagined a wall would fall like this. I don't know if we can last until your reinforcements arrive." Jon set his jaw, his eyes hardening with resolve. "We have no choice." A long silence passed between them as the storm raged around them. Daenerys stepped closer, placing a hand on Drogon's warm flank. "We hold," she said firmly. "We hold until the last man. until the last dragon, until the last breath. Stannis gave a slow nod. Then we had best start preparing. And with that, the defenders turned back to their task. The battle was far from over, and the true war was only beginning. The next few days were a test of endurance. Though the breach had been blocked, white still trickled through cracks in the ice, forcing the Night's Watch into constant battle. The men fought bravely, but exhaustion set in. Every hour, more men fell to frostbite, fatigue, or the blade of an undead foe. The defenders were strong, but the dead were endless. Jon, Daenerys and Stannis stood atop an unbroken portion of the wall, surveying the battlefield below. The army of the dead stretched as far as the eye could see, hundreds of thousands of whites, swarming like insects, piling atop one another in their desperation to climb. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the bitter cold of unnatural winter. Frost clung to armour and skin alike, turning men into statues if they stood still too long. Below, the screams of the dying echoed up to them, cut short only by the crunch of bone or the shriek of steel against ice. At the edge of the forest, they spotted a group of White Walkers sat astride their skeletal horses, watching with cold amusement. Their piercing blue eyes glowed eerily. They were in no hurry. They had all the time in the world. "They aren't attacking," Daenerys murmured. "They're just waiting." Jon narrowed his eyes. "They know we can't last forever." Stannis exhaled, his breath misting in the air. "For the last year, I've worked with every maester I could find across all the 7 kingdoms to learn as much as I could about the White Walkers. I believe if we kill their leader, the rest will fall." Jon turned to him sharply. "Are you certain?" Stannis folded his arms. "No, it is but a theory, but it's the only one we have." Daenerys frowned, glancing back at the endless horde. "If we strike at the White Walkers directly, we might stand a chance. But how do we reach them? They won't enter the battle until they know victory is certain." Jon thought for a long moment, before drawing Darksister from its scabbard. The Valyrian steel gleamed in the pale light, sharp and deadly. "Then we force their hand." Stannis allowed himself a rare smile. "That's a fine blade, and it may be our best chance." Daenerys studied Jon carefully, her violet eyes full of concern. "If you go after them alone, you'll be walking into their trap." Jon tightened his grip on Darksister. "Let me make it our trap instead." They devised a plan, bait the White Walkers into believing the wall was on the brink of collapse. By deliberately widening the breach and allowing a surge of whites through, the White Walkers would be drawn closer, believing victory was imminent. That was when Jon and Daenerys would strike. As the plan was set into motion, the battle raged with renewed intensity. The defenders retreated strategically, allowing the dead to push further in. The White Walkers, sensing their moment, finally urged their skeletal steeds forward, drawing themselves nearer to the wall. Jon and Daenerys exchanged a look before mounting their dragons. The time had come. They soared high into the sky, banking sharply before diving in unison. Dragonfire engulfed the White Walkers' position, incinerating the skeletal horses in an instant. Yet as the flames cleared, the Night King and his generals stood untouched, their ice weapons gleaming in the fire. Jon dismounted, stepping forward with Darksister in hand. The Night King regarded him with something close to amusement, his icy blue eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Snow swirled around them, the air thick with the howling wind and the distant screams of men still locked in battle. The Night King slowly drew his own blade, a sword of frozen death that radiated a cold so deep Jon felt it even from several paces away. Then, without warning, the Night King moved. The duel was unlike anything Jon had ever fought. The Night King was impossibly fast, his blade a blur of motion, striking with a force that sent tremors up Jon's arms. Dark Sister met ice with a resounding clash, Valyrian steel barely holding against the unholy chill of the Night King's weapon. Jon gritted his teeth, stepping back under the relentless assault, each blow coming faster than the last. The Night King fought with an eerie grace. His strikes were methodical, relentless, and impossibly precise. Jon countered as best he could, sidestepping one strike and parrying another. But the Night King's unnatural strength wore him down. His lungs burned in the freezing air, his limbs growing heavier with each passing moment. Then, in a sudden movement, the Night King extended a hand and clenched his fingers into a fist. A deafening, bone-chilling wail erupted across the battlefield as the dead began to rise once more. Fallen wights stirred, their lifeless eyes flickering back to icy blue as they clawed their way to their feet. The defenders, exhausted and bloodied, cried out in horror as the corpses of their fallen brothers turned against them. The tide of the battle had shifted again, the dead returning in greater numbers than before. Jon's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had only moments before the horde overwhelmed them all. High above, Daenerys saw the Night King's move and did not hesitate. She spurred Drogon and Valnir into action, unleashing torrents of dragonfire upon the rising dead. The flames roared through the battlefield, consuming wights before they could fully stand. The Night King tilted his head slightly, as if in irritation, but then turned his full attention back to Jon. Jon barely had time to raise Dark Sister before the Night King lunged again. This time, he pressed the attack harder, his strikes hammering against Jon's defences with inhuman speed. A feint, a twist of the wrist, and suddenly the icy blade found its mark. Cold agony lanced through Jon as the Night King's sword drove into his side, piercing through his armour as if it were nothing. He gasped, staggering, his vision swimming. The Night King leaned in, twisting the blade cruelly, his lips curling into what might have been the mockery of a smile. Jon fell to one knee. His strength was failing. The Night King raised his sword for one final blow, preparing to end the battle once and for all. But as the blade came down, Jon forced every ounce of will he had left into one final act of defiance. With a roar of pure determination, he swung Dark Sister in a wide arc. Valyrian steel met ice once more. Only this time, Jon did not miss. The blade cleaved through the Night King's neck in one clean stroke. For the briefest of moments, the world seemed to pause. The Night King's eyes widened in shock, before his body splintered like fragile glass, shattering into 1,000 shards of ice that scattered across the snow. A deafening silence followed. Across the battlefield, the army of the dead collapsed in unison. Wights crumbled, their bodies breaking apart and dissolving into dust. The White Walkers, watching from afar, shattered like their master, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The storm began to break, the unnatural cold lifting as the darkness of the long night seemed to retreat. Jon let out a ragged breath, swaying where he stood. The cold in his veins spread, his body growing numb. He tried to take a step, but his legs gave out. Dark Sister slipped from his grasp as he collapsed onto the frozen ground. Daenerys landed Drogon nearby, running toward him, her face a mixture of relief and terror. She reached out, cradling his face in her hands, but Jon's eyes were distant, unfocused. His breath came in shallow gasps before finally stilling. The battle was won, but at what cost? As Daenerys stared down at Jon's unmoving body, the wind howled once more, carrying with it the echoes of something unseen, something waiting beyond the veil of death. The bells of King's Landing tolled in joyous celebration. their deep chimes echoing through the golden streets. Banners bearing the sigil of House Targaryen, black dragons on crimson fields, fluttered in the warm breeze. The city, once torn apart by war and strife, had never seen such revelry. From the Red Keep to Flea Bottom, wine flowed freely, music and laughter filled the air, and the people danced in the streets, praising the new reign. The great hall of the Red Keep was filled with lords and ladies from every corner of Westeros, their finest garments gleaming beneath the golden chandeliers. The room had been restored to its former glory, its high ceilings draped with banners, not only of House Targaryen, but of all the great houses who had survived the long night. This was not merely a victory feast, it was a declaration of a new era, an era of unity and of peace hard won. Daenerys Stormborn, Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, stood at the head of the grand table, adorned in a gown of deep red and black, the colours of her house. Her silver hair was braided in intricate loops, and a crown of Valyrian steel rested upon her head. The room quieted as she raised her goblet, her violet eyes scanning the gathered nobles. "My lords and ladies," Daenerys began, her voice steady and strong. "We stand here today not as separate kingdoms, but as one people, united, forged in fire, tempered in ice. The long night has ended, and we have prevailed." A thunderous applause erupted. The Queen allowed it for a moment before raising a hand, silencing the crowd. "We have suffered, we have bled, we have lost loved ones to the endless darkness that sought to consume us all, but together we have endured. And now, under the light of the sun, we look to the future, not as conquerors, but as builders. Westeros will never again be torn apart by the greed and ambition of petty lords. Today, we usher in a new age, one built on strength, justice, and prosperity." The court roared its approval, the sound reverberating through the hall. Daenerys took a breath, letting the moment settle before she continued. "But there is one above all who we must honour today, one whose sacrifice ensured our survival, a man who, with steel and fire, faced death itself and emerged victorious, a man who fought when all others would have fallen, a man I am proud to call my king, my husband." A hush fell over the hall. Many believed this was a solemn toast to a fallen warrior, a final tribute to the legendary Jon Snow, the man who had slain the Night King in single combat. Daenerys raised her goblet high. "To King Jon Targaryen." The hall erupted into cheers. But then, from the high table, a hand lifted a goblet in response. Gasps filled the chamber as all eyes turned toward the source. Jon Targaryen sat in a grand chair, alive but visibly weary. His once broad shoulders were slightly hunched, his face still bearing the scars of his battle. A thick bandage wrapped around his ribs, hidden beneath the dark fabric of his tunic. Though he looked thinner than before, his grey eyes still held the fire of the north. A grin appeared across his lips as he raised his cup. "You'll forgive me for not standing just yet," he said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence, "but I seem to have misplaced my strength somewhere north of the wall." The hall erupted into laughter, followed by a raucous wave of applause. Lords clapped, ladies raised their goblets, and even the usually solemn northern lords let out hearty cheers. Daenerys turned to him, warmth in her gaze. She gently placed a hand over his, and in that moment, the weight of their shared journey settled over them both. They had won, not just the battle, but the future. In the years that followed, the reign of King Jon Targaryen and Queen Daenerys Stormborn became legend. Their rule was just and strong, bringing peace to a land that had long been scarred by war. The North remained loyal, the Reach flourished, and even the Iron Islands found prosperity in this new age. The wall was rebuilt, but not as a prison. For the first time in history, Free folk and southerners alike lived in harmony. The scars of war had faded, replaced by fields of wheat, bustling markets, and great cities filled with laughter instead of fear. The long night had come and gone, and the world had been reborn. And so, under the rule of the dragon and the wolf, Westeros thrived, its people forever remembering the night a man of ice and fire faced death and won.